in a Benedictine monastery where stone walls hold the warmth of centuries and the scent of growing things mingles with ancient prayer, a monk named Edmund finds his deepest peace among the rows of healing plants. The year is 1342, and spring has just begun to wake the English countryside. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will carry us to a monastery in the west of England in the spring of 1342, where we will follow Brother Edmund, keeper of the herb garden, through the gentle rhythms of tending the plants that heal and nourish his community. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. The morning began as it always did, with the bells for lauds ringing softly across the monastery grounds while darkness still held the world. Brother Edmund rose from his narrow bed in the dormitory, his body knowing the rhythm so well that he needed no thought to guide him. The stone floor was cool beneath his feet, a pleasant sensation that helped him wake gently into the day. Around him, his brothers moved in the same quiet dance, each man finding his sandals, smoothing his habit, preparing for the first prayers of the day. The chapel was dim and peaceful, lit only by a handful of candles that sent their warm glow across the worn wooden pews. Edmund found his usual place near the back, where he could see the small window that looked out toward the garden. Even in the darkness, he could sense the garden there, waiting for him, patient as it had been patient for all the keepers who had tended it before him. The chanting began, the familiar Latin words flowing around him like water, and Edmund let his voice join the others, the sound filling the chapel with a texture as rich and layered as good soil. When the service ended and the brothers filed out into the growing dawn, Edmund made his way toward the garden through the covered walkway that connected the chapel to the outer buildings. The air was cool and damp, carrying the promise of rain later in the day, and Edmund breathed it in deeply, grateful for the moisture that would feed his plants. He had been keeper of the herb garden for 7 years now, since the previous keeper, old Brother Anselm, had grown too frail to manage the daily work. Edmund remembered those last months, when Anselm had walked beside him through every bed and border, teaching him the names of each plant in Latin and in the Old English that country people used, showing him which leaves to harvest and when, which roots held the most strength, which flowers made the gentlest remedies for the sick in the infirmary. The garden gate was a simple thing, wooden slats bound with iron, and it opened with a familiar creak that Edmund had long since stopped noticing. Inside, the garden stretched before him in neat rectangular beds divided by paths of crushed stone. Even this early in the spring, there was green everywhere. The perennial herbs had begun their patient return, sending up new growth from roots that had survived the winter beneath the soil. Edmund walked slowly along the first path, his eyes taking in each bed with the attention of someone reading a beloved book, noting what had changed since yesterday, what needed his care today. The comfrey was showing strong new leaves, their rough texture catching the morning light. Edmund knelt beside the bed, his knees settling into the damp earth with the ease of long practice, and reached out to touch one of the leaves gently. It was firm and healthy, the plant drawing up strength from the deep roots that Anselm had told him could reach as far down as a man was tall. Comfrey was good for healing wounds, for knitting broken bones, for soothing inflammation. The infirmarian, Brother Gilbert, would want fresh leaves soon for the poultices he made. Moving to the next bed, Edmund found the sage beginning to show its silver-green growth, the leaves still small but already carrying that distinctive scent that reminded him of both medicine and cooking. He touched the soil around the plants, feeling its texture, testing its moisture. It was damp enough still from the recent rains, but he would need to watch it. Sage preferred soil that drained well, and this bed sometimes held water too long if the spring was especially wet. He made a mental note to bring a basket of sand from the stream later in the week, to work into the soil around the sage plants, helping the water move through more freely. The fennel bed next, where the feathery leaves were just beginning to emerge, looking like green threads against the dark earth. Edmund smiled at the sight. Fennel was one of his favorite plants to watch grow, the way it reached upward with such delicate grace, the way it moved in even the gentlest breeze. It was good for digestion, for settling troubled stomachs, and the seeds, when they came later in the summer, made a pleasant tea that many of the brothers enjoyed after their evening meal. He worked his way methodically through the garden, checking each bed, touching each plant, his hands moving with the gentle certainty of someone who had performed these same actions countless times. There was something deeply peaceful about this morning inspection, the way it required his full attention while asking nothing urgent of him. Each plant was simply itself, growing at its own pace, following patterns that were older than the monastery, older than any human memory. Edmund was simply the current keeper, the one who watched and tended and learned, who would one day pass this knowledge to another monk, just as Anselm had passed it to him. The sun was fully up now, though still hidden behind the clouds that promised rain. The light was soft and even, the kind of light that made everything look gentle and slightly blurred, as if the world were wrapped in fine cloth. Edmund heard the bells for prime ring out, calling the brothers back to the chapel for the next service, and he rose from where he had been kneeling beside the bed of the lady's mantle, brushing the damp earth from his habit. He would return after prime, he thought, and begin the day's real work. There was weeding to be done in the thyme bed, and he wanted to check the lavender that he had planted last autumn to see how well it had survived its first winter in this soil. The chapel service passed in its familiar rhythm, the prayers and chants creating a space of calm that carried Edmund forward into the day. When it ended, he joined his brothers in the refectory for the morning meal, taking his place at one of the long wooden tables where they ate in silence while one of the younger monks read aloud from a holy text. The bread was fresh and still slightly warm from the baking, and there was mild cheese and small beer to wash it down. Edmund ate slowly, mindfully, tasting the simple goodness of the food, grateful for the nourishment it provided. After the meal, as the brothers dispersed to their various tasks and duties, Edmund returned to his garden. The clouds had grown heavier, and he could smell the rain approaching on the breeze. Good, he thought. The garden would drink deeply today, and he could spend the time under the covered shelter at the garden's edge, working on preparations for the remedies that Brother Gilbert would need in the coming weeks. He went first to the small stone building at the back of the garden, the drying shed where bundles of herbs hung from the rafters and clay pots lined the shelves along the walls. The air inside was thick with scent, layer upon layer of fragrance from dozens of different plants, some sharp and clean, others soft and slightly sweet, all of them mingling into something that smelled like medicine and memory and time. Edmund breathed it in, feeling the familiar comfort of this place settle around him like a well-worn cloak. He had harvested feverfew the previous autumn, and it hung now in neat bundles tied with twine, the small white flowers dried to a pale cream color, the leaves brittle and ready to be stripped from their stems. Brother Gilbert had been treating one of the older monks for terrible headaches, and feverfew tea had been helping ease the pain. Edmund took down one of the bundles and carried it to the work table that stood beneath the shed's wide overhang, a space where he could work while staying dry even in the heaviest rain. The table was smooth from years of use, its surface marked with small stains from various plant juices and oils. Edmund had his tools arranged in their usual places, a sharp knife for cutting, a wooden bowl for catching stripped leaves, cloth bags for storing the finished herbs, a larger basket for stems and debris that would go to the compost heap. Everything in its place, everything ready, a pattern of preparation that made the work flow without thought or hesitation. He began stripping the feverfew leaves from their stems, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. The leaves released their scent as he worked, bitter and slightly sharp, and he remembered Anselm telling him that this same bitterness was what made the plant effective against pain. The body recognized the strong taste and responded to it, though Edmund did not pretend to understand exactly how. He simply knew that it worked, that generations of herbalists had used feverfew for headaches, and that it continued to bring relief to those who needed it. The first drops of rain began to fall as he worked, gentle patterns on the roof of the shed, a sound so familiar and pleasant that Edmund felt himself relax even further into the rhythm of his task. The rain grew steadier, creating a soft curtain between him and the rest of the garden, a veil of water that made the world feel smaller and more intimate. He could see the plants receiving the rain, their leaves lifting slightly as if in gratitude, the soil darkening as it absorbed the moisture. Edmund worked steadily through the morning, stripping leaves from several different bundles of herbs, sorting them into separate cloth bags, making sure each was properly labeled with the plant name and the date of harvest. This was important work, this preparation and organization, because Brother Gilbert needed to know exactly what he was working with when he made his remedies. A mistake could mean giving someone the wrong treatment, and while none of Edmund's herbs were truly dangerous, some were more powerful than others and needed to be used with care and knowledge. When the bells rang for sext, the midday service, Edmund set aside his work and walked through the rain to the chapel. The drops were warm for spring, and he did not hurry, letting them fall on his face and hands, feeling them soak gradually into the wool of his habit. There was something cleansing about walking through rain, something that made him feel renewed and ready for the afternoon's tasks. The service was brief, as sext always was, a moment of prayer and reflection in the middle of the day's work. Edmund let the Latin words wash over him like the rain had done, not thinking about their meaning so much as simply letting them be present, part of the rhythm that shaped the monastery's days and weeks and years. After sext came dinner, the main meal of the day. eaten in the same mindful silence as breakfast had been. Today there was pottage made with dried beans and leeks, thick and nourishing, served with more of the good bread. Edmund ate his portion slowly, savoring the warmth and substance of it, feeling it fill him with the energy he would need for the afternoon. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle by the time he returned to the garden, and Edmund decided to do some actual tending work rather than more preparation. The thyme bed had been calling to his attention for several days now, small weeds beginning to establish themselves among the low-growing plants, and this damp weather made it the perfect time to pull them. The soil would release the weeds' roots easily when it was moist like this, and the thyme would hardly be disturbed by his careful work. He knelt at the edge of the thyme bed, a woven cushion beneath his knees to spare them from the damp ground, and began to work his way slowly along the bed's length. Thyme was a plant that liked to spread, sending out stems that rooted wherever they touched the soil, creating a dense mat of aromatic growth. Edmund loved the smell of it, the way even the gentlest touch released that clean, slightly pungent scent. It reminded him of summer, of long, warm days when the bees would work the tiny flowers, and the whole garden would hum with their peaceful industry. The weeding work required his full attention, but in a way that was restful rather than taxing. He had to look carefully to distinguish the small weed seedlings from the thyme itself, had to use his fingers precisely to pinch the weeds at their base and pull them gently, but firmly, getting all the roots without disturbing the thyme around them. His hands knew this work so well that they moved almost without his conscious guidance, finding the weeds, removing them, moving forward along the bed in a slow, meditative progression. Time seemed to soften and stretch as he worked. The afternoon passed without his notice, marked only by the gradual changes in the light and the eventual cessation of the rain. When he finally sat back on his heels and looked at what he had accomplished, he saw that he had cleared nearly half the bed, the thyme looking neat and tidy now, freed from competition, ready to put all its energy into new growth as the season progressed. Edmund stood slowly, his knees protesting slightly after the long time spent kneeling, and stretched his back with care. He was not as young as he had been when he first took on the garden's keeping, and he had learned to respect his body's limits, to work steadily rather than straining to accomplish everything at once. The garden would still be here tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. There was always more to do, but there was also always time to do it, season following season in their patient rhythm. He walked through the garden one more time before going to Vespers, the evening service, checking to see how the rain had treated his plants. Everything looked fresh and renewed, the leaves clean and glistening, the soil dark and satisfied. The lady's mantle had caught raindrops in the cup-like folds of its leaves, holding them like tiny jewels, and Edmund paused to admire this small beauty before moving on. The evening service brought all the brothers together in the chapel once more, their voices joining in the chants that marked the day's slow turn toward night. Edmund found his usual place and let himself sink into the familiar words, his body tired in the good way that came from honest work, his mind quiet and content. Through the small window, he could see the sky beginning to clear, patches of pale blue showing between the thinning clouds, the promise of a fair evening ahead. After Vespers came supper, a lighter meal than dinner had been. Tonight there was bread and cheese again, and some early greens that the kitchen garden had provided, dressed with a little oil and vinegar. Edmund ate slowly, grateful for the food, for the community of his brothers around him, for the peaceful structure of the day that held them all. When the meal was finished and the brief period of recreation began, Edmund chose to return once more to his garden, rather than joining the brothers who gathered in the warming room to talk quietly or work on small tasks. He often spent this hour before compline, the final service of the day, simply being present in the garden, observing it in the gentler light of evening, noticing things he might have missed during his busier working hours. The air had grown cooler with the clearing of the clouds, and Edmund pulled his cowl up over his head as he walked the familiar paths. The evening light made everything look softer. The edges of leaves and stems blurred slightly, colors muted to gentler versions of themselves. He could hear birds settling into the hedgerow that bordered the garden's eastern side, their sleepy chirping a pleasant background music that spoke of day's end and approaching rest. Edmund made his way to the bed where he had planted lavender the previous autumn. He had been uncertain about these plants through the winter, checking them each time the weather warmed enough for him to get out to the garden, looking for signs of life, for proof that they had survived the cold months. Lavender could be temperamental in this climate, preferring the warmer, drier lands to the south, and Edmund had chosen his planting spot carefully, placing the lavender in the bed that received the most sun and had the sandiest soil. Now, kneeling beside the bed in the evening quietly, he could see clear evidence of success. Each of the 6 plants he had set out showed fresh green growth emerging from the woody stems, new shoots reaching upward with that distinctive narrow-leaved form that marked them unmistakably as lavender. Edmund felt a quiet satisfaction at the sight, a small pride in having managed this challenge successfully. He touched one of the new shoots gently, careful not to damage it, and thought ahead to midsummer when these plants would bloom and fill this corner of the garden with their sweet, calming fragrance. Brother Gilbert had specifically requested that Edmund try growing lavender, hoping to have fresh flowers for making oil to help the brothers who struggled with sleeplessness or anxiety. Edmund himself sometimes had trouble quieting his mind enough for sleep, and he looked forward to having lavender oil available, imagining rubbing a small amount on his temples before bed, letting the scent carry him gently into rest. He moved on from the lavender to check the bed of lemon balm that grew in the partial shade of the garden's north wall. Lemon balm was one of the easiest herbs to grow, almost too easy, as it wanted to spread everywhere if given the chance. Edmund had learned to be vigilant about pulling up seedlings that appeared where they were not wanted, and he made a mental note now that he would need to do some thinning here soon. The plants were growing thick and strong, their leaves already showing that bright green color and releasing their fresh, citrus-like scent when he brushed against them. The monastery's bees loved lemon balm, and Edmund had often watched them working the small white flowers that would appear later in the season. There was something deeply satisfying about growing plants that served multiple purposes, that gave medicine to humans and nectar to bees, that were beautiful to look at and useful to harvest. It felt like participating in the kind of generous abundance that Edmund associated with divine grace, everything giving to everything else in an endless circle of support and nourishment. As he stood beside the lemon balm bed, Edmund heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel path and turned to see Brother Gilbert approaching, moving with his characteristic slow, careful gait. Gilbert was older than Edmund by perhaps 15 years, his hair gone mostly gray, his face lined with the marks of a life spent in service and study. He had been infirmarian for more than 20 years, tending to the brothers' various ailments with patience and skill, and he and Edmund had developed a close working relationship, each man respecting the other's knowledge and dedication. "Good evening, Edmund," Gilbert said softly, his voice carrying easily in the garden's quiet. "I thought I might find you here." "Good evening, brother," Edmund replied, feeling pleased by the company. "The garden looks well after the rain." "It does indeed," Gilbert agreed, his eyes moving over the beds with an appreciative gaze. "I came to ask about feverfew. I stripped the last of what you gave me yesterday, and I will need more soon. Brother Ambrose's headaches continue, though the tea helps him considerably." "I prepared several bags this morning," Edmund told him. "I can bring them to you after Compline or tomorrow morning if you prefer." "Tomorrow will serve well enough," Gilbert said. "There is no urgency. The tea is helping, and Ambrose is learning to drink it regularly rather than waiting until the pain becomes severe." He paused, looking around the garden with evident pleasure. "This is a peaceful place you tend, Edmund. I always feel better for spending a few moments here." Edmund nodded, understanding exactly what Gilbert meant. The garden had a particular quality of peace that seemed to intensify in the evening hours when the work was done, and there was nothing required except presence and attention. "It keeps me well," he said simply. "I think I receive more from it than I give." "That is the nature of good work," Gilbert observed. "When we serve well, we are ourselves served. The garden teaches you its lessons, and you carry them to the rest of us through the herbs you grow." They stood together in comfortable silence for a few moments, and then Gilbert turned to go, touching Edmund's shoulder briefly in a gesture of affection and respect. "I will let you finish your evening round," he said. "Thank you for the feverfew and for all the rest. We are fortunate to have you as our keeper." Edmund felt warmed by the words, though he deflected them with characteristic humility. "The garden keeps itself," he said. "I am merely the one who watches." But as Gilbert walked away, Edmund allowed himself to feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing his work mattered, that the herbs he tended brought real help to his brothers, that this piece of ground he cared for was woven into the life of the whole community in ways both practical and spiritual. He completed his evening circuit of the garden, checking the beds of mint and oregano, the small stand of elecampane whose tall flowering stems would appear later in the summer, the patch of calendula that would bloom bright orange in another month or two. Everything was as it should be, plants growing in their proper places, following their ancient patterns, asking nothing of him beyond what he was glad to give. The bells for Compline rang out across the monastery grounds, their sound carrying clearly through the evening air. Edmund made his way toward the chapel for the final service of the day, the prayers that would mark the transition into night and sleep. The light was fading now, the western sky showing streaks of pale gold and soft pink where the sun had gone down behind the hills. In the chapel, the brothers gathered in the near darkness, only a few candles burning now, their flames steady and still in the windless air. The chant for Compline was different from the other services, slower and more contemplative, designed to quiet the mind and prepare the body for rest. Edmund sang the familiar words, feeling them work their gentle magic, his thoughts settling, his breathing deepening, the day's activities fading into pleasant memory. When the service ended, the brothers filed out in silence, maintaining the great silence that would hold until after lauds the next morning. Edmund walked slowly to the dormitory, removed his sandals, and lay down on his narrow bed. Through the high window, he could see a few early stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and he watched them for a moment before closing his eyes. His body was pleasantly tired, and he could still smell the subtle scent of herbs on his hands, even though he had washed them before supper. Thyme and feverfew, lemon balm and comfrey, all the green growing things that filled his days with purpose and peace. He thought briefly of the work that would wait for him tomorrow, the other half of the thyme bed to weed, the fever to deliver to Brother Gilbert, the everyday round of tasks that shaped his life into something meaningful and good. Sleep came easily, as it usually did after a day spent in the garden, his dreams filled with green growth and gentle rain, with the patient rhythms of plants reaching toward light, roots reaching down into dark earth, everything following the patterns that had been set before human memory began. The next morning began like the one before it, the bells for lauds ringing softly in the darkness, Edmund rising and making his way to the chapel with his brothers. The day's first prayers, the simple breakfast, and then he was back in his garden as the sun rose over the eastern wall, painting the beds with fresh morning light. He returned to the thyme bed and continued the weeding work he had begun the previous afternoon, settling into the same meditative rhythm, the same careful attention to distinguishing weed from herb, the same gentle but firm pulling, getting all the root, disturbing the surrounding plants as little as possible. The morning air was cool and fresh after yesterday's rain, and Edmund worked in perfect comfort, his body warm enough from the effort but not too warm, the temperature exactly right for sustained physical labor. By the time the bells rang for terce, the third hour prayer, Edmund had finished the thyme bed completely. It looked beautiful now, neat and healthy, the plants able to spread and grow without competition, and he felt satisfied with the morning's work. He brushed the soil from his hands and his habit and made his way to the chapel, arriving just as the first notes of the chant began. After terce, there was a period of time before the midday meal, and Edmund decided to use it for sowing some seeds. It was still early in the season, but certain herbs could be started now, particularly the ones that took a long time to germinate and grow large enough to transplant. He wanted to sow parsley, which was notoriously slow to sprout, and some borage, whose blue flowers the bees loved and whose leaves made a cooling addition to summer drinks. He prepared a small bed in the sunniest part of the garden, working the soil with a hand fork until it was fine and crumbly, removing any stones or debris, creating the perfect seed bed. The soil was still damp from the rain, which was ideal for sowing. Seeds needed moisture to germinate, and this bed would hold water well enough without becoming waterlogged. Edmund opened the small leather pouch where he kept his parsley seeds, seeds that he had collected himself from plants he had let go to seed the previous summer. They were tiny, brown and curved, and he held a few in his palm for a moment before beginning to sow them, marveling as he always did at the mystery of how such small, dry things contained within them the complete instructions for becoming full green living plants. He sowed the seeds thinly and evenly, making shallow drills with his finger and dropping the seeds along each row, then covering them gently with a fine layer of soil. Parsley could take 3 or 4 weeks to germinate, sometimes longer, and it required patience. But Edmund had learned patience from the garden itself. Everything happened in its own time, and rushing accomplished nothing except anxiety and disappointment. The borage seeds were larger and easier to handle, and he sowed them in a separate section of the bed, spacing them a bit more generously than the parsley. Borage grew into substantial plants with large hairy leaves and those beautiful star-shaped blue flowers that seemed to glow with their own inner light. It was good for cheering the heart, Anselm had told him, good for lifting sadness and bringing comfort. Edmund had sometimes made tea from the fresh leaves for brothers who seemed particularly burdened or melancholy, and he had seen it help, seeing the gentle brightening of spirits that came from the plant's simple gift. When the sowing was done, Edmund marked each section with small wooden stakes that he had inscribed with the plant names, making sure he would remember what was growing where. Then he went to the water barrel that stood near the tool shed and filled a large clay jug, carrying it carefully back to the newly sown bed. He watered gently, using his hand to spread the water in a soft shower rather than pouring it directly, not wanting to disturb the seeds or wash them from their proper positions. The bells for Sext rang out while he was still watering, and Edmund finished quickly, set down the jug, and hurried to the chapel, arriving slightly breathless but in time for the opening prayers. He had bits of soil on his habit and probably on his face as well, but no one minded. They were all working men here, monks who spent their days in various labors, and a bit of honest dirt was nothing to be ashamed of. After Sext came dinner, and today the pottage was made with dried peas and onions, thick and warming, served with cheese and bread. Edmund ate mindfully as always, but he was already thinking ahead to the afternoon's work. He wanted to check the comfrey bed more carefully, to see if any of the plants were large enough to harvest yet. Brother Gilbert used comfrey frequently in his poultices, and a fresh supply would be welcome. The afternoon was warm and bright, the kind of spring day that hinted at the summer to come. Edmund made his way back to the garden after dinner, feeling the pleasant heaviness of a full stomach, the satisfaction of good food eaten in good company. The sun was high now, pouring light onto the garden beds, and Edmund could almost see the plants responding to it, their leaves turning to catch the rays, their stems stretching upward. He went first to the comfrey bed, kneeling beside it to examine the plants more closely. Comfrey was generous with its growth, sending up thick stems covered in rough, hairy leaves that were slightly scratchy to the touch. Edmund ran his hand gently over several plants, assessing their size and vigor. Yes, he decided, There were at least 3 or 4 that were large enough to harvest from without damaging the plant's ability to continue growing. He fetched his harvesting basket from the tool shed, along with his sharp knife, and returned to the comfrey bed. The trick with harvesting comfrey was to take leaves from the outside of the plant, the older, larger ones, leaving the young central growth intact so the plant could continue producing. Edmund selected his first leaf carefully, tracing its stem down to where it met the base of the plant, then cutting cleanly just above the crown. The leaf came away easily, and he laid it in his basket, then moved to the next plant. The work was simple and rhythmic, requiring just enough attention to keep his mind engaged but not so much that it felt taxing. He moved from plant to plant, selecting leaves, cutting them cleanly, laying them carefully in his basket so they would not bruise. The rough texture of the leaves reminded him of a cat's tongue, that same slightly abrasive quality, and he smiled at the thought. The monastery had several cats who lived in the barns and helped keep the mice population under control, and Edmund enjoyed their company when they occasionally wandered into the garden to sun themselves on the warm stones of the paths. By the time he had harvested enough comfrey to fill his basket halfway, his back was beginning to protest the constant bending, and he stood to stretch, rolling his shoulders and tilting his head from side to side to ease the tightness in his neck. He was aware, always, of the need to listen to his body, to recognize its limits and respect them. The garden would still be here tomorrow, and there would be time for everything that needed doing. He carried the basket to the drying shed, where he would prepare the comfrey leaves for Brother Gilbert. Fresh leaves could be used immediately for poultices, but it was also good to have dried leaves available, as they kept well and could be stored for months without losing their healing properties. Edmund spread half of the leaves he had harvested on one of the drying racks, arranging them so they did not overlap, allowing air to circulate around each leaf. The other half he would take to Brother Gilbert fresh, still full of their moisture and vitality. While he was in the drying shed, Edmund checked on the feverfew he had prepared the previous day. The leaves had settled nicely in their cloth bags, and he selected 3 of the fullest bags to take to the infirmary. He tucked them into a clean linen sack, tied it closed, and set it aside to deliver after his afternoon work in the garden was complete. Returning to the garden proper, Edmund decided to spend some time on the bed where his medicinal flowers would bloom later in the season. This bed held calendula, which would produce bright orange flowers throughout the summer and into autumn, and chamomile, whose small white and yellow flowers made the most soothing tea Edmund knew. Neither plant was showing much growth yet, as both were relatively slow to establish in the spring, but the bed needed attention nonetheless. Weeds had begun to appear among the emerging plants, and Edmund settled himself at the edge of the bed to remove them. This was different from the time bed weeding, as these plants were more widely spaced and the weeds larger and more established. He worked slowly, making sure to get each weed's entire root system, not wanting to leave any pieces behind that might regenerate. Some of the weeds were quite stubborn, and he had to work his fingers deep into the soil to trace their roots down and pull them cleanly. The soil here was particularly good, dark and rich from years of careful tending, from the compost that Edmund worked into it each autumn. from the careful rotation of plants that ensured no bed became depleted. He could feel the quality of it in his hands, the way it crumbled easily, the way it smelled of life and fertility. Good soil was the foundation of everything. Anselm had taught him, and Edmund had taken that lesson to heart, spending time and effort on building and maintaining the soil's health. As he worked, Edmund became aware of a small bird singing nearby, perched somewhere in the hedgerow. He could not see it, but its song was clear and bright, a cascade of notes that seemed to tumble over each other in joyful abandon. Edmund paused in his wedding to listen, struck as he often was by the simple beauty of such moments. The warm sun on his back, the good soil in his hands, the bird singing its heart out for no reason except that it was alive and spring had come. These were the gifts that the garden gave him daily, gifts that had nothing to do with herbs or healing, but everything to do with being present in the world, paying attention to its small wonders. The bird eventually flew away, and Edmund returned to his weeding, working his way slowly along the bed. He found himself thinking about Brother Ambrose, the monk whom Brother Gilbert was treating for headaches. Edmund did not know Ambrose well, as the man worked primarily in the monastery's library, copying and repairing manuscripts, rarely venturing out to the gardens or workshops where Edmund spent his time. But Edmund had seen him occasionally, had noticed the way Ambrose would sometimes press his fingers to his temples, his face drawn with pain. It gave Edmund a deep satisfaction to know that the fever he tended could bring Ambrose relief, that the work of his hands in this garden could ease another man's suffering. This was what Anselm had meant, Edmund thought, when he had spoken of service, of how the garden was not just a place for growing plants, but a way of caring for the whole community, a way of participating in the great web of mutual support that held the monastery together. By the time the bells rang for none, the 9th hour prayer, Edmund had finished weeding the flower bed and had moved on to checking the bed of mint that grew in the dampest corner of the garden, near where a small spring trickled from beneath the wall. Mint was nearly impossible to kill, growing with wild enthusiasm anywhere it found sufficient water, and Edmund's main task with it was to keep it from spreading beyond its designated area. He pulled up the runners that had crept into neighboring beds, and he made a mental note that he would need to dig a deeper barrier around the mint bed before next spring, something to contain its enthusiastic expansion. The prayer of none was brief, a moment of pause in the afternoon's work, and Edmund welcomed it as he always did. The rhythm of the divine office, the 8 prayer services that marked each day, gave structure to his time in a way that felt supportive rather than constraining. He always knew where he was in the day, what came next, when he would gather with his brothers to lift their voices together in praise and petition. After none, Edmund finally made his way to the infirmary with his sack of feverfew. The infirmary was housed in a separate building on the monastery's eastern side, away from the main dormitory and chapel, giving the sick and injured some quiet and privacy for their recovery. It was a long, low building with several small rooms opening off a central corridor, and Brother Gilbert's workroom was at the far end, where he prepared his medicines and stored his supplies. Edmund found Gilbert at his work table, grinding something in a mortar with steady, rhythmic strokes of the pestle. The infirmarian looked up when Edmund entered, his lined face breaking into a smile of welcome. "Edmund, good afternoon," Gilbert said, setting down his pestle. "Is that the feverfew?" "Yes, brother," Edmund replied, opening the sack and showing the cloth bags inside. "I prepared 3 bags for you. Each should be enough for several batches of tea." Gilbert took one of the bags and opened it, bringing it to his nose and inhaling deeply. "Excellent," he said with satisfaction. "The scent is strong and fresh. You have a gift for knowing exactly when to harvest." He set the bag on his table and took the others from Edmund, storing them carefully on a shelf where various other dried herbs waited in their own cloth bags and clay jars. "How is Brother Ambrose?" Edmund asked. "Much improved," Gilbert replied. "The feverfew tea is helping considerably, and I have also suggested some changes to his routine that may prevent the headaches from starting. He was spending too many hours bent over his manuscripts without pause, straining his eyes and his neck. I have counseled him to stand and walk briefly every hour, and to make sure he works in the best light available." Edmund nodded, thinking of his own awareness of how his body responded to long periods in one position. "That is wise counsel," he said. "The body needs movement and variety." "Indeed it does," Gilbert agreed. He gestured to the chair beside his work table. "Sit for a moment if you have time. I wanted to ask your advice about something." Edmund settled into the chair, curious. Gilbert was considerably more knowledgeable about medicine than Edmund would ever be, so it was unusual for him to seek Edmund's advice. "I have been treating Brother Martin for a persistent cough," Gilbert explained. "It is not serious, but it troubles him, particularly at night when he is trying to sleep. I have been giving him coltsfoot tea, which helps somewhat, but I wondered if you had any horehound available. I think the combination might be more effective." "I do have a horehound," Edmund said, thinking of the bed where that particular herb grew. "Though it is early in the season yet, and the plants are not as full as they will be later, but there should be enough leaves to harvest a small amount. Would you like me to bring some tomorrow?" "That would be excellent," Gilbert said. "There is no urgency, as the coltsfoot is providing some relief, but when you have a chance to harvest it, I would be grateful." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and then Edmund rose to leave. "I should return to the garden," he said. "There are a few more tasks I want to complete before Vespers." "Of course," Gilbert said. "Thank you for the fever, Edmund, and for your constant care of the garden. We are all in your debt." Edmund made his way back to the garden, feeling the warmth of Gilbert's appreciation but also slightly embarrassed by it. He did not think of himself as doing anything particularly special, simply fulfilling the duties of his role, tending the plants that had been placed in his care. But he supposed that was true of all the brothers, each man doing his part, each contributing to the whole in his own particular way. The afternoon light was beginning to soften and slant, creating longer shadows across the garden beds. Edmund walked to the horehound bed and examined the plants, considering how much he could harvest without damaging their ability to continue growing. Horehound was a sturdy plant with furry gray-green leaves and a somewhat bitter scent, not unpleasant but quite distinctive. It was excellent for coughs and chest complaints, helping to loosen congestion and soothe irritated throats. He decided to take just a few stems from each of the 4 largest plants, enough to provide Brother Gilbert with what he needed, but not so much that the plants would struggle. He cut carefully, always at an angle just above a leaf node, a technique that encouraged the plant to bush out rather than simply sending up a single tall stem. Within a few minutes, he had gathered enough horsehound to make a small bundle, and he carried it to the drying shed to hang alongside the fever and other herbs already there. The garden was particularly beautiful in this late afternoon light, Edmund thought as he walked slowly along the paths for what he knew would be his final circuit before evening prayers. The low angle of the sun made every leaf and stem stand out in sharp relief, creating a landscape of light and shadow that seemed almost to pulse with life. He could see insects moving among the plants, small beetles and flies going about their business, and he felt a kinship with them, all creatures doing their work, following their nature, contributing to the great pattern of existence. He paused by the lavender bed again, pleased to see how well the new growth was developing. The plants were still small, still establishing themselves, but they showed every sign of thriving, and Edmund allowed himself to imagine the garden in midsummer, when these plants would be covered in their purple flower spikes, filling the air with their incomparable fragrance. The bells for Vespers rang out across the monastery grounds, and Edmund made his way toward the chapel, his body tired in the good way that came from steady physical work, his mind peaceful and clear. The evening service washed over him like gentle water, the chants and prayers as familiar as his own breath, and when it ended and he made his way to supper, he felt deeply grateful for the life he had been given, for this place and these people and this work that filled his days with meaning and purpose. Supper was simple, as it always was, bread and cheese and some early radishes from the kitchen garden, crisp and slightly peppery. Edmund ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware of the nourishment entering his body, the way it would fuel his work tomorrow and the day after that, the endless succession of days that made up a life. After supper came the brief recreation period, and tonight Edmund chose to spend it in quiet conversation with Brother Peter, who managed the monastery's small vineyard. They sat together in the warming room, speaking in low voices about the season's progress, comparing notes about what the spring had brought and what they hoped the summer would yield. Peter was concerned about a late frost that was being predicted, worried that it might damage the tender new grape leaves, and Edmund listened sympathetically, offering what comfort he could. When the bells for Compline rang, Edmund and Peter made their way together to the chapel for the day's final prayers. The light was nearly gone now, just a faint glow remaining in the western sky, and the chapel was dim and hushed, the perfect setting for these prayers that marked the transition into night. Edmund sang the familiar words, feeling them settle into his bones, preparing him for sleep and rest. The great silence descended as the brothers left the chapel, each man making his way quietly to the dormitory. Edmund removed his sandals and lay down on his bed, pulling the thin blanket over himself. Through the window, he could see the first stars beginning to appear, tiny points of light in the vast darkness, and he watched them for a moment before closing his eyes. His last thoughts before sleep were of the garden, of the work waiting for him tomorrow, of the parsley and borage seeds beginning their slow journey toward germination in the dark soil, of the horehound drying in bundles, and the comfrey spreading its healing leaves on the rack. It was all part of the same continuous work, he thought, the same patient attention to growth and care, and he felt himself drifting into sleep with that thought, his breathing deepening, his body releasing the day's efforts into the forgiving embrace of rest. The next morning came with mist, a thick white blanket that lay over the monastery grounds and made everything look soft and mysterious. Edmund could barely see the garden from the dormitory window as he dressed in the pre-dawn darkness, but he knew it was there, waiting for him as it always did, patient and constant. After lauds and breakfast, he made his way through the mist to the garden gate, his habit growing damp from the moisture in the air. The mist had a particular smell, clean and slightly earthy, and it muffled all sounds, creating an atmosphere of intimacy and seclusion. Edmund could barely see more than a few feet ahead of him as he walked the paths, checking on his plants through the white veil. The herbs were covered in tiny droplets of water, each leaf holding its own small collection of moisture, and Edmund marveled at the beauty of it, at how the mist transformed the familiar garden into something magical and strange. He touched the rosemary plant that grew near the gate, feeling the dampness on his fingers, and the plant released its sharp, clean scent into the misty air. Today, Edmund had planned to work on propagating some of his perennial herbs, taking cuttings from established plants to create new ones. This was work that Anselm had taught him carefully, showing him which plants responded well to this treatment and which preferred to be grown from seed. Rosemary was one that propagated beautifully from cuttings, as did sage and lavender, and Edmund wanted to increase his stock of all three. He began with the rosemary, selecting several strong stems from the main plant and cutting them just below a leaf node, each cutting about as long as his hand from fingertip to wrist. The stems were woody at the base but still flexible enough to root, and Edmund gathered a small bundle of them before moving on to the sage bed. The sage plants were still relatively small this early in the season, but there were a few that were large enough to take cuttings from without causing them harm. Edmund chose his stems carefully, always taking from the side growth rather than the main central stem, ensuring the mother plant could continue growing vigorously. The sage leaves were soft and gray-green, almost velvety to the touch, and they released their distinctive scent as he worked, a smell that made Edmund think of both medicine and cooking, of healing teas and savory dishes. He took his cuttings to the potting bench in the tool shed, where he had prepared a mixture of sand and soil for rooting them. This part of the work required careful attention and a gentle touch. Edmund stripped the lower leaves from each cutting, leaving just a few at the top, then dipped the cut end into a small pot of water before pushing it carefully into the sandy mixture. The water helped the cutting slide into the growing medium without damage, and the sand would provide the drainage that these Mediterranean plants preferred. One by one, Edmund potted his cuttings, working slowly and methodically, making sure each one was firmly seated in its pot but not so deeply buried that it might rot. He had learned through experience that the key to successful propagation was patience and attention to detail, never rushing, always making sure each step was done properly. By the time he had finished potting all his cuttings, the mist was beginning to lift, pulled away by a gentle breeze that had risen with the warming day. Edmund could see more of the garden now, the beds emerging from the white veil like islands appearing from fog. He arranged his newly potted cuttings in a sheltered corner of the shed where they would receive gentle light but not harsh sun, and he watered them carefully, knowing that they would need consistent moisture while they developed their new roots. The bells for terce called him to prayer, and he went willingly, feeling satisfied with the morning's work. The propagation work was an investment in the future, creating new plants that would eventually be placed in the garden or given to other monasteries that might need them. It was one of the ways that knowledge and resources were shared among the religious communities, each place supporting the others, creating a network of mutual aid that stretched across the land. After terce, Edmund decided to check on his seed bed, though he knew it was far too early to expect any germination yet. Still, he liked to observe the bed daily, to make sure the soil was staying moist but not waterlogged, to watch for any issues that might need addressing. He found the bed exactly as he had left it, the soil slightly damp, the wooden markers standing straight, everything peaceful and promising. While he was kneeling by the seed bed, Edmund heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see Brother Thomas, one of the younger monks, walking toward him with a somewhat hesitant expression. Thomas worked primarily in the scriptorium, copying manuscripts, and Edmund did not know him particularly well, though they shared meals and prayers daily like all the brothers. "Brother Edmund," Thomas said softly, stopping a respectful distance away, "I hope I am not disturbing your work." "Not at all," Edmund replied, rising to his feet and brushing soil from his habit. "How may I help you?" Thomas looked slightly embarrassed and he glanced down at his feet before speaking. "I have been having difficulty sleeping," he said quietly. "I lie awake at night, my mind too active, thoughts racing, and I cannot find rest. Brother Gilbert suggested I might speak with you, that you might have an herb that could help." Edmund felt a surge of sympathy for the young monk. He himself had experienced such nights occasionally, particularly when he was younger and less settled in his vocation, and he remembered how exhausting and frustrating it could be. "I do have something that might help," he said gently. "Come with me." He led Thomas to the drying shed and found a small cloth bag, which he began to fill with a mixture of dried herbs. "This is a combination that often helps with sleep," he explained as he worked. "Chamomile for its calming properties, a little lavender for relaxation, and some lemon balm to quiet an active mind. You steep it in hot water before bed and drink it slowly, letting the warmth and the scent settle you." Thomas watched with evident interest as Edmund measured out the herbs and tied the bag closed. "Thank you," he said, taking the bag carefully when Edmund handed it to him. "This is very kind of you." "It is my purpose," Edmund replied simply. "If you find it helps, come back and I will make you more. And if it does not help as much as you would like, tell me that as well, and we will try something different." Each person responds to herbs in their own way, and sometimes it takes trial to find what works best. Thomas nodded, looking somewhat relieved to have this tangible help for his problem. "I will let you know," he promised. "Thank you again, Brother Edmund." As Thomas walked away, Edmund felt the familiar satisfaction of being able to offer help, to use his knowledge and the garden's gifts to ease another person's difficulty. This was the heart of his work, really, not just the tending and harvesting, but the giving, the sharing of what the earth provided so generously. The rest of the morning passed in quiet work. Edmund spent time trimming back some of the woody growth on his established sage plants, a task that would encourage them to produce fresh, tender leaves rather than putting all their energy into old, tough stems. The trimmed pieces he added to the compost heap behind the tool shed, where they would slowly break down and return their nutrients to the soil, completing the cycle. At Sext, the midday prayer, Edmund found himself standing next to Brother Ambrose in the chapel, and he was pleased to see that the man looked considerably better than he had the last time Edmund had noticed him. His face relaxed and peaceful rather than pinched with pain. Ambrose caught Edmund's eye after the service and smiled briefly, a small acknowledgement of gratitude that needed no words. Dinner was pottage again, this time made with barley and some of the early greens from the kitchen garden, and Edmund ate with a good appetite, his morning's work having given him a healthy hunger. The reading during the meal was from the Rule of Saint Benedict, the guidelines that govern their monastic life, and Edmund found comfort in the familiar words, the emphasis on balance and moderation, on work and prayer woven together into a seamless whole. The afternoon was warm and bright, the mist having burned away completely to reveal a sky of brilliant blue. Edmund decided to work on preparing another bed for planting, a section that he wanted to use for growing more medicinal flowers. The soil here had become somewhat compacted over the winter, and it needed to be loosened and enriched before it would be ready to receive new plants. He fetched a fork from the tool shed and began the work of turning the soil, driving the tines deep into the earth and then levering them up, breaking apart the compacted clumps, allowing air to penetrate. It was hard physical work, and Edmund found a rhythm to it, the push and lift and turn becoming almost meditative in its repetition. His muscles warmed with the effort, and he paused occasionally to rest, leaning on the fork handle and looking around the garden, appreciating the beauty of the day and the peaceful industry of his work. As he worked, Edmund thought about the cycle of the seasons, how each one brought its own particular tasks and gifts. Spring was for planting and new growth, for the excitement of watching seeds germinate and young plants establish themselves. Summer would bring the peak of growth and the main harvests, when the garden would be at its most abundant, and he would spend long days cutting and drying herbs for winter use. Autumn was for gathering seeds, for making final harvests, for preparing the garden for winter's rest. And winter itself was for planning and dreaming, for repairing tools and organizing stores, for the quieter indoor work that sustained the monastery through the cold months. He was part of this cycle, Edmund reflected, as much as the plants themselves were. His life turned with the seasons, his work shaped by their demands and opportunities, his whole existence woven into the great pattern of growth and rest, abundance and dormancy. It was a good way to live, he thought, connected to the earth's rhythms, attentive to the natural world's teachings. By the time he had finished turning the soil in the new bed, his back was aching pleasantly, and his hands were tired from gripping the fork handle. He added several baskets of well-rotted compost to the turned soil, spreading it evenly, and then working it in with the fork, mixing the rich brown material into the lighter-colored earth beneath. The compost would feed the new plants, providing nutrients and improving the soil's structure, making it easier for roots to penetrate and establish themselves. When the bed was finally ready, Edmund stood back to admire his work. The soil looked dark and rich, loose and inviting, perfect for receiving seeds or young plants. He felt a deep satisfaction at the sight, at this tangible result of his labor, this preparation for future growth and abundance. The bells for none rang out, and Edmund cleaned his tools carefully before putting them away, then washed his hands at the water barrel and made his way to the chapel. The brief service gave him a chance to rest his tired muscles, and when it ended, he decided to spend the remaining time before Vespers doing some lighter work, checking on plants rather than engaging in heavy digging or harvesting. He walked slowly through the garden, observing everything with fresh eyes, as if seeing it for the first time. The bed of oregano was showing good growth, the small leaves already carrying that warm, slightly peppery scent. The patch of calendula had tiny seedlings emerging, their first true leaves just beginning to develop. The comfrey he had harvested from a few days ago was already showing signs of recovery, new leaves beginning to unfurl from the plant's centers. Everything was progressing as it should, Edmund noted with quiet pleasure, each plant following its own internal timing, responding to the warmth and light and moisture in ways that were both predictable and miraculous. He paused by the bed where his medicinal roots grew, the elecampane and valerian that would not be ready for harvest until late summer or autumn. These plants worked more slowly than the leafy herbs, building their strength underground where it could not be seen, and Edmund appreciated the patience they required, the faith that what was hidden was nevertheless growing. Near the garden's far corner, where a small apple tree provided dappled shade, Edmund discovered something that made him smile with delight. A clump of violets had appeared, their heart-shaped leaves spreading in a low rosette, and their small purple flowers nodding on delicate stems. He had not planted these violets, had not even known they were there, and he realized they must have been dormant in the soil, their seeds waiting perhaps for years until conditions were exactly right for germination. Edmund knelt beside the violets and examined them carefully. They were healthy and vigorous, already showing signs of spreading, and he decided to leave them exactly where they were. Violets had their own modest healing properties, good for coughs and skin troubles, but more than that, they were beautiful, a gift from the earth itself, a reminder that the garden held mysteries and surprises beyond what any keeper could plan or control. He thought of showing the violets to Brother Gilbert, who he knew appreciated such small beauties, but then decided against it. Some discoveries were meant to be kept private, at least for a while, to be savored in solitude before being shared. Edmund sat back on his heels and simply looked at the violets for several long moments, taking in their delicate beauty, their quiet presence, the way they seemed perfectly at home in this shaded corner of the garden. The afternoon light was growing softer now, taking on that golden quality that came in the hours before evening. Edmund stood and continued his walk through the garden, his pace unhurried, his attention open to whatever might present itself. He noticed that the lemon balm was attracting small insects, tiny flies that hovered around the plants, and he watched them for a moment, appreciating their role in the garden's ecology, the way everything connected to everything else in ways both visible and invisible. At the bed where he grew tansy, a tall plant with fern-like leaves and button-shaped yellow flowers, Edmund paused to pinch back some of the growing tips. Tansy could become quite large and sprawling if left unchecked, and he preferred to keep it compact and bushy, easier to harvest from and less likely to shade out neighboring plants. The pinched-off tips he tucked into his pocket, thinking he might add them to the compost heap later, though tansy had such a strong scent that he sometimes wondered if it made the compost too pungent. He became aware as he worked of the sounds around him, the small symphony of the garden's life. Birds called from the hedgerow, their voices carrying clearly in the still air. Bees hummed among the early flowers, moving from blossom to blossom with purposeful industry. The breeze whispered through the leaves of the apple tree, creating a soft rustling that was almost like speech. And beneath it all, the deeper silence, the quiet that underlay every sound, the peace that was always present if one knew how to listen for it. The bells for vespers rang out while Edmund was still in the garden, and he made his way toward the chapel with reluctance, wanting to stay longer in this peaceful place, but also ready to join his brothers in prayer. The evening service was particularly beautiful today, the light coming through the chapel's small windows at just the right angle to create patterns on the stone floor, and Edmund found himself deeply moved by the combination of chant and light, sound and silence, community and solitude all woven together. After vespers came supper, and tonight there was fish, a gift from one of the monastery's benefactors who had access to the river. It had been prepared simply, baked with herbs, and Edmund recognized the taste of his own oregano and thyme in the dish. There was something satisfying about this connection between garden and table, about seeing his work transformed into nourishment for his community. During the recreation period that followed supper, Edmund found himself in conversation with Brother William, who managed the monastery's small flock of sheep. William was older than Edmund by a decade or more, his face weathered from years spent outdoors, his hands rough and capable. They talked about the spring lambs that had recently been born, and William invited Edmund to come see them when he had time, an invitation that Edmund accepted gladly. He had always found comfort in the presence of animals, their simplicity and directness, the way they lived so completely in the present moment. "The new lambs are finding their legs now," William said with evident pride. "Strong and healthy, all of them. We were fortunate this year. No difficulties with the birthing, and the ewes are all producing good milk." Edmund listened with interest, appreciating the parallels between William's work and his own. Both of them were tenders of living things, both responsible for nurturing growth and ensuring health, though one worked with animals and the other with plants. "I would very much like to see them," Edmund said. "Perhaps tomorrow afternoon if you are there." "I am always there," William replied with a gentle laugh. "The sheep keep their own schedule, not mine. Come whenever you can, and we will walk among them together." When Compline came, Edmund felt the familiar settling that the day's final prayers always brought, the sense of completion and release. He sang the words with his whole heart, letting them carry away any remaining tension or concern, preparing himself for the night's rest. In the dormitory, as he lay on his narrow bed watching the stars appear in the darkening sky, Edmund thought about the violets he had discovered, those small purple flowers that had appeared as if by magic, and he felt grateful for a life that held such simple, unexpected beauties. Sleep came easily, and Edmund's dreams were peaceful, filled with images of growing things and gentle rhythms, with the sensation of soil in his hands and sun on his back, with the endless patient work that gave his days their meaning and purpose. The next morning brought clouds, thick and gray, hanging low over the monastery and promising rain before the day was through. Edmund welcomed the prospect of rain, knowing his garden would benefit from the moisture, and he planned his day's work accordingly, choosing tasks that could be done under cover or that would be pleasant even in wet weather. After the morning prayers and breakfast, he made his way to the drying shed to check on the herbs that were currying there. The air inside was thick with layered scents, and Edmund breathed deeply, identifying each one. Fever and horehound, comfrey and lemon balm, all the plants he had harvested over the past days, all of them slowly releasing their moisture into the air, concentrating their healing properties into forms that could be stored and used throughout the coming months. He turned the herbs on their drying racks, making sure they were currying evenly, checking for any signs of mold or spoilage. Everything looked good, the leaves turning crisp and brittle as they should, their colors fading slightly but their scents remaining strong. In another few days, most of these herbs would be ready to be stripped from their stems and stored in jars or cloth bags, ready for Brother Gilbert's use. While he was working in the shed, Edmund heard the first drops of rain begin to fall, a gentle pattering on the roof that quickly grew steadier. He looked out and saw the rain falling straight down, no wind to drive it sideways, just a soft, steady soaking rain that would penetrate deep into the soil. Perfect, he thought. Exactly what the garden needed. He decided to spend the rainy morning working on organizing his seed collection, a task he had been meaning to do for some time. The seeds were stored in small leather pouches and clay pots on a shelf in the tool shed, and over the winter they had become somewhat disorganized, different types mixed together, labels unclear or missing. Edmund carried the entire collection to the work table under the shed's overhang and began the careful work of sorting and identifying. Some seeds were easy to recognize by sight. The large, curved seeds of parsley, the smaller but distinctively shaped borage seeds, the tiny dark seeds of thyme. Others required more careful examination, and Edmund found himself relying on memory and subtle differences in size or color to determine what was what. He worked slowly and methodically, creating separate piles for each type of seed, then finding clean pouches for them and writing clear labels in his careful script. The rain continued to fall as he worked, creating a peaceful background sound that helped him focus on the detailed task before him. Edmund found himself thinking about Anselm again, remembering the old monk's lessons about seed saving, about how to recognize when seeds were truly ripe and ready for harvest, about how to clean and dry them properly for storage. Anselm had been a patient teacher, never rushing, always willing to explain something twice or three times until Edmund truly understood. Edmund missed him still, though several years had passed since Anselm's death. The old monk had simply grown frailer and frailer through his final autumn and winter, until one morning he had not woken for lauds, had slipped away in his sleep as peacefully as if he were simply continuing a pleasant dream. Edmund had been grateful that Anselm's passing had been so gentle, free from pain or struggle, and he thought the old man would have appreciated the simplicity of it, the way it fit with the natural rhythms he had honored throughout his life. By the time the bells rang for terce, Edmund had finished organizing his seeds, each type now in its own properly labeled pouch, the whole collection arranged neatly on the shelf in alphabetical order. It was satisfying work, bringing order to chaos, ensuring that when planting time came, he would be able to find exactly what he needed without confusion or delay. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and Edmund was glad of it. The garden could use a good long soaking, and he enjoyed having this time to work on indoor tasks, to catch up on the organizing and planning that sometimes got neglected during the busier seasons. After terce, he decided to check on the cuttings he had potted the previous day, to make sure they were settling in well and had sufficient moisture. The cuttings looked healthy, their leaves still firm and green, no signs of wilting or stress. Edmund watered them gently, using a small clay pitcher that allowed him to direct the water precisely where it was needed. These cuttings would take several weeks to develop roots, and during that time they would need consistent attention, regular watering, and protection from harsh conditions. But Edmund was patient, and he knew that if he cared for them properly, most of them would succeed and would develop into strong young plants that could eventually be transplanted into the garden or given to other communities. At Sext, Edmund joined his brothers in the chapel and found himself standing next to Brother Thomas, the young monk to whom he had given the sleep tea. Thomas caught his eye after the service and gave him a small, grateful smile, and Edmund understood without words that the tea had helped, that Thomas was sleeping better. The exchange lasted only a moment, but it filled Edmund with quiet satisfaction, with the knowledge that his work mattered, that it made a real difference in the lives of those around him. Dinner was hearty, a thick soup made with dried beans and some of the salted pork that had been put up the previous autumn, and Edmund ate with appreciation, warming himself from the inside as the rain continued to fall outside. The afternoon stretched before him, and he decided to spend it making an inventory of his dried herb stores, checking what he had in abundance and what was running low, planning what he would need to harvest more of as the season progressed. He returned to the drying shed after dinner and began taking down the jars and cloth bags from the shelves, opening each one to check its contents and assess the quantity. Some herbs, like the feverfew and horehound he had recently prepared, were well stocked. Others, like chamomile and lavender, were running quite low, their supplies depleted over the winter months when Brother Gilbert had used them frequently for the brothers suffering from winter ailments and sleep troubles. Edmund took out a piece of parchment and a stick of charcoal and began making notes, his handwriting careful and clear despite the crude writing implement. Chamomile would bloom in another month or so, and he would need to harvest the flowers regularly throughout the summer to rebuild his stock. The lavender was trickier, as his established plants were few, and the new ones he had planted last autumn would not be ready for harvesting this year. He would need to harvest carefully from his mature plants, taking only what he could spare while leaving enough blooms to help the plants build their strength. As he worked through his inventory, Edmund felt the deep satisfaction that came from understanding his resources, from knowing what he had and what he needed, from being able to plan ahead with confidence. This kind of knowledge came only from years of patient attention, from daily presence in the garden, from the accumulated experience of watching plants through their full cycle season after season. The rain continued throughout the afternoon, sometimes heavier and sometimes lighter, but never stopping completely. Edmund could hear it drumming on the shed roof, could see it falling in silvery sheets beyond the overhang, and he was grateful for the shelter, for the dry space where he could work comfortably while the garden drank its fill outside. When he finished his inventory, Edmund spent some time repairing a large woven basket that had developed a crack in its weaving. He soaked some willow withies in water to make them pliable, then carefully wove them through the damaged section, strengthening it and extending the basket's useful life. It was simple work, requiring attention but not intense concentration, and Edmund found it pleasant, the kind of task that allowed his mind to wander while his hands stayed busy. His thoughts drifted to the conversation he had had with Brother William about the lambs, and he found himself looking forward to visiting the sheep fold, to seeing the new life that had come into the world. There was something deeply hopeful about newborn animals, about their obvious vitality and trust, the way they embodied the eternal renewal of life. Edmund thought about how his work with plants and William's work with animals were both fundamentally about nurturing, about providing what was needed for growth and flourishing, about paying attention to the small signs that indicated health or distress. The bells for none rang out through the rain, and Edmund set aside his basket mending and made his way to the chapel. His habit was damp from walking through the rain, and the chapel felt cool, but the familiar prayers warmed him from within, the sense of community and shared purpose that came from gathering with his brothers multiple times each day. After none, the rain finally began to ease, thinning to a light drizzle and then stopping altogether, though the clouds remained thick and gray overhead. Edmund ventured out into the garden to see how it had weathered the long rain, and he found everything looking refreshed and vibrant. The leaves washed clean, the soil dark and saturated with moisture. Small puddles had formed in the lower areas of some paths, but they would drain away by morning, and in the meantime they reflected the gray sky like tiny mirrors. Edmund walked slowly through the garden, his footsteps making soft sounds on the wet gravel paths. Everything smelled intensely alive, that particular scent that came after rain, a combination of wet earth and growing plants, and that mysterious something that seemed to be the smell of life itself. He breathed it in deeply, feeling it fill his lungs, feeling grateful for this moment, this place, this work that had been given to him. At the violet patch, he knelt to check on the small plants, and he was pleased to see they had taken no harm from the rain. If anything, they looked more vigorous, their leaves a deeper green, their flowers seeming to glow in the dim light. Edmund touched one of the flowers gently, marveling at its delicate construction, the way such a small, fragile thing could persist and thrive in the world. He spent the remaining time before Vespers simply being present in the garden, walking slowly, observing, letting his practiced eye note what had changed, what needed attention, what was thriving. The newly prepared bed he had worked on the previous day had taken the rain beautifully. The compost he had mixed in helping the soil absorb and hold moisture without becoming waterlogged. The seed bed where he had planted parsley and borage showed no signs of disturbance, the rain having fallen gently enough that it had not washed away the carefully placed seeds. At Vespers, Edmund found himself deeply moved by the evening light that filtered through the chapel windows, pale and soft through the clouds, creating an atmosphere of gentle melancholy that suited the prayers perfectly. He sang with his whole heart, letting the music carry him, feeling it resonate in his chest and throat, becoming part of something larger than himself. Supper was simple but satisfying: bread and cheese, and some preserved fruit from the previous autumn's harvest. Edmund ate mindfully, aware of each bite, grateful for the food and the hands that had prepared it. During recreation, he finally had the opportunity to visit Brother William and see the new lambs, walking across the monastery grounds to the sheep fold as the clouds began to break apart and evening light broke through in long golden shafts. The sheepfold was a sturdy wooden structure with a covered area for shelter and a fenced yard where the sheep could graze. As Edmund approached, he could hear the lambs bleating, their high, thin voices mixing with the deeper responses of their mothers. Brother William was there, as he had said he would be, leaning on the fence and watching his flock with evident contentment. "Brother Edmund," William greeted him warmly. "Come, see what the Lord has blessed us with this spring." Edmund joined William at the fence, and his breath caught slightly at the sight before him. There were perhaps a dozen lambs, all of them white or cream-colored, all of them moving with that characteristic bouncing gait that young lambs had, full of energy and curiosity. They stayed close to their mothers but were clearly eager to explore, to test their legs, to discover the world around them. "They are beautiful," Edmund said softly, not wanting to startle the animals with a loud voice. "They are indeed," William agreed, "and healthy, everyone. That ewe there, the one with the mark on her shoulder, she had twins, both thriving, both strong. I worried she might not have enough milk for both, but she is managing beautifully." They stood together in companionable silence, watching the lambs play and nurse, watching the ewes graze calmly or lie in the soft hay that William had spread for them. Edmund felt the same sense of peace here that he felt in his garden, the same recognition of participating in something larger and older than any individual life, the great pattern of growth and nurturing that connected all living things. One of the lambs approached the fence where Edmund and William stood, its dark eyes curious and unafraid. It bleated softly, and Edmund reached out slowly, letting the lamb sniff his hand. Its nose was soft and slightly damp, and after a moment it allowed Edmund to touch its woolly head, the texture springy and warm beneath his fingers. "They trust easily at this age," William said. "Later they will be more cautious, but now they are open to the world, curious about everything." Edmund nodded, thinking about how plants were similar in some ways, how seedlings seemed almost eager to grow, reaching toward light and moisture with an openness that mature plants tempered with the wisdom of experience. There was something profoundly moving about new life in all its forms, about the way it embodied hope and possibility and trust. The bells for Compline rang out across the monastery grounds, and Edmund reluctantly took his leave of William and the sheep, making his way back toward the chapel for the day's final prayers. The clouds had continued to break apart, and now patches of clear sky showed through, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening spaces. The air smelled fresh and clean after the rain, and Edmund breathed it in gratefully, feeling blessed by the day he had been given, by the work and the community and the small beauties that had filled his hours. In the chapel, the brothers gathered for the last time, their voices joining in the familiar chants that marked the transition into night. Edmund sang the words with a full heart, feeling himself being carried toward sleep and rest, toward the renewal that night would bring. When the service ended and the great silence descended, he walked to the dormitory with slow steps, not wanting to rush this peaceful conclusion to the day. In his narrow bed, Edmund lay watching the stars through the window, listening to the quiet breathing of his brothers around him, feeling the pleasant tiredness in his muscles from the day's work. His last thoughts before sleep were of the garden waiting for him in the morning, of the seeds germinating invisibly in their bed, of the cuttings developing roots in their pots, of all the patient processes that continued even while he slept, the great work of growth and life that never stopped, never paused, always continuing in its ancient rhythms. Sleep came gently, and Edmund's dreams were filled with green growing things, with the smell of rain on soil, with the soft bleating of lambs and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. The morning came clear and bright, the storm having passed completely during the night, leaving behind a world that sparkled with moisture and seemed somehow more vivid than before. Edmund rose with the bells for lauds, feeling rested and ready for the day, and he made his way to the chapel with a sense of anticipation, eager to see how the garden had settled after yesterday's long rain. After the morning prayers and breakfast, Edmund went straight to the garden, and he found it looking magnificent in the morning light. Every leaf seemed to glow with health, every plant standing taller and fuller than it had before the rain. The soil was still damp but not waterlogged, perfect for working, and Edmund felt a surge of energy and purpose as he surveyed his domain. Today, he decided, he would begin transplanting some of the calendula seedlings that had germinated in their bed. They were large enough now to be moved to their permanent locations, and the moist soil would make transplanting easier, less stressful for the young plants. He gathered his tools, a small trowel and a flat wooden dibber for making holes, and a basket to carry the seedlings. The transplanting work required care and gentleness, and Edmund approached it with the kind of meditative focus that such delicate tasks demanded. He began by digging small holes in the bed he had prepared the previous day, spacing them evenly, making each hole deep enough to accommodate the seedling's roots without crowding or bending. Then he returned to the seed bed and began carefully lifting the young calendula plants, using his trowel to take a generous amount of soil with each one, keeping the roots as intact as possible. Each seedling was placed in its new hole with tender precision, the soil firmed gently around it, a small depression left at the base to catch and hold water. Edmund worked slowly and steadily, losing himself in the rhythm of the task, the repetitive motions becoming almost a form of prayer, an offering of attention and care to these small green lives he was responsible for. The sun climbed higher as he worked, warming his back and shoulders, and Edmund paused occasionally to stretch and rest, to look around the garden and appreciate the beauty of the morning. Birds sang in the hedgerow, their music bright and cheerful, and Edmund found himself humming softly along with them, his own small addition to the symphony of life that surrounded him. By the time the bells rang for terce, Edmund had transplanted 24 calendula seedlings, and they stood in their new bed looking slightly shocked but fundamentally healthy, their leaves already beginning to lift toward the sun. He watered them carefully, giving each plant a good drink to help settle its roots into the new soil, then cleaned his tools and made his way to the chapel, his hands and habit earth-stained but his heart light with the satisfaction of good work accomplished. The prayer of terce was brief and refreshing, a moment of rest in the morning's work, and when it ended, Edmund returned immediately to the garden. He wanted to check on his newly transplanted calendulas once more, to make sure they were settling in well, and then he planned to spend some time weeding the bed where his culinary herbs grew, the ones that the kitchen brothers used for cooking. The calendulas looked good, their leaves beginning to relax from the initial shock of transplanting, and Edmund felt confident they would establish themselves well in their new location. By midsummer, these plants would be producing their cheerful orange flowers in abundance, and he would harvest them regularly for Brother Gilbert's salves and ointments, which used the flowers to promote healing of wounds and skin troubles. Moving to the culinary herb bed, Edmund found it in need of attention. Small weeds had established themselves among the parsley and chives, the summer savory and marjoram, all the herbs that added flavor and interest to the monastery's simple meals. He settled himself at the edge of the bed and began the familiar work of weeding, his fingers moving with practiced certainty, distinguishing weed from herb, pulling gently but firmly, taking care not to disturb the plants he was trying to protect. The chives were showing strong growth, their hollow tubular leaves standing upright and their small purple flower buds just beginning to form at the tips. Edmund had always liked chives, both for their mild onion flavor and for their cheerful flowers, which were not only beautiful but also edible, making a pretty addition to salads. He made a mental note to tell Brother Martin, who oversaw the kitchen, that the chives would soon be ready for harvesting, in case he wanted to use some in the meals. The marjoram was spreading nicely, creating a low mat of aromatic leaves that released their scent whenever Edmund's hands brushed against them. It was a smell he associated strongly with summer cooking, with roasted vegetables and savory stews, and it made him think ahead to the warmer months when the garden would be at its most productive, and the kitchen would be receiving regular deliveries of fresh herbs and vegetables. As he worked, Edmund became aware of someone approaching, and he looked up to see Brother Martin himself walking toward him, his round face creased in a friendly smile. Martin was a cheerful man, rotund from years of tasting his own cooking, and he had a gift for making even the simplest ingredients into something nourishing and pleasant. "Good morning, Brother Edmund," Martin called out as he drew near. "I thought I might find you here. The weather is too fine to be anywhere else, I think." "Good morning," Edmund replied, rising from his weeding and brushing soil from his hands. "I was just thinking of you. The chives are nearly ready if you want to begin using them." Martin's face brightened. "Excellent news. I have been waiting for fresh herbs. The dried ones served us well through the winter, but there is nothing like the taste of fresh growth." He paused, looking around the garden with evident appreciation. "Everything looks so healthy. You have a true gift for this work, Edmund." Edmund felt himself flush slightly at the praise, uncomfortable as always with such direct compliments. "The plants do the growing," he said. "I only try not to interfere too much with their natural ways." "That is wisdom," Martin observed. "To know when to act and when to simply allow. Not everyone understands that." He moved closer to the herb bed and knelt down, touching the marjoram gently. "This will be lovely in the bean dishes we will be making soon. And the summer savory here, that will be perfect with the first peas when they come." They talked for a few more minutes about which herbs would be ready when, about what Martin was planning for the summer meals, about the ways the garden and kitchen worked together to feed the community. Edmund enjoyed these conversations with Martin, appreciated the way the kitchen brother understood and valued the garden's contributions, never taking them for granted, but always expressing genuine gratitude for what was provided. After Martin left, Edmund returned to his wedding, but his mind was filled with pleasant thoughts of the connection between his work and the meals that sustained his brothers. It was easy to think of the garden as separate from the rest of the monastery's life, a quiet place apart, but in reality, it was deeply woven into the community's daily existence, touching everyone through the medicines that healed them and the flavors that made their simple meals more enjoyable. The morning passed peacefully, Edmund working his way methodically through the culinary bed until every weed had been removed and the herbs stood clean and unencumbered. By the time the bells rang for sext, his back was aching slightly and his knees were stiff from kneeling, but he felt deeply satisfied with what he had accomplished. The midday prayer refreshed him, and dinner afterward was hearty and good, a thick barley porridge with onions and some early greens. Edmund ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware that some of the flavor came from the herbs he himself had grown and dried, that his work was literally being transformed into nourishment before him. The afternoon was warm, the sun now high and strong, and Edmund decided to spend it working under the partial shade of the apple tree, where he could tend the violets he had discovered and also check on the plants that grew in that cooler, damper section of the garden. This area was home to plants that preferred less sun, herbs like sweet woodruff and lady's mantle, and they needed attention to keep them from being crowded out by more aggressive growers. He settled himself near the violets and began carefully removing grass and other weeds that were encroaching on their space. The violets were spreading already, sending out runners that would root and form new plants, and Edmund was careful to give them room, pulling weeds from around them but letting the violets expand as they wished. These volunteers, plants that appeared without being deliberately sown, often did particularly well, as they had chosen their own ideal location rather than having one assigned to them. The lady's mantle nearby was showing its characteristic pleated leaves, each one holding drops of water from yesterday's rain in its center, tiny perfect spheres that caught the light like jewels. Edmund had always found the lady's mantle beautiful, both for these water-catching leaves and for the delicate yellow-green flowers it would produce later in the season. The plant had modest healing properties, useful for women's troubles and for treating wounds, but Edmund grew it as much for its beauty as for its utility. As he worked in the shade, Edmund heard a rustling in the hedgerow and looked up to see one of the monastery's cats emerging from the undergrowth. A large orange tom who sometimes visited the garden to hunt mice or simply to sun himself on the warm stones. The cat paused when it saw Edmund, its green eyes assessing, then apparently decided he was no threat and continued on its way, moving with that characteristic feline grace toward a patch of sunlight near the tool shed. Edmund smiled at the sight, appreciating the cat's independence and self-sufficiency. The monastery's cats were not pets exactly, though some of the brothers were fond of them and would occasionally offer them scraps from meals. They were working animals, earning their keep by controlling rodents, but they maintained a dignity and autonomy that Edmund respected. They were part of the monastery's ecosystem, just as the birds and bees and earthworms were, each creature playing its role in the larger pattern. The afternoon passed in this peaceful work, Edmund moving from task to task as his attention was drawn to different needs. He trimmed back some of the sweet woodruff that was trying to creep beyond its designated area. He tied up some of the taller growing herbs that were beginning to flop in the heat. He checked his water barrels to make sure they had been adequately refilled by the rain. Each task was simple in itself, but together they formed the continuous web of care that kept the garden healthy and productive. At none, Edmund joined his brothers for the brief afternoon prayer, grateful for the interruption, for the chance to rest his body and refresh his spirit. The chapel was dim and cool after the brightness outside, and Edmund let his eyes adjust slowly, letting himself sink into the familiar rhythm of chant and response. After none, there was time for one more task before Vespers, and Edmund decided to check on his propagation cuttings again. He was pleased to find them looking healthy, their leaves still firm, no signs of wilting or disease. It was still too early for them to have developed roots, but they showed every indication of success, and Edmund felt a quiet anticipation about seeing them grow into full plants over the coming weeks. He watered them carefully, then stood for a moment simply observing them, thinking about the way plants could regenerate themselves from cuttings, the way a small piece of stem could become an entire new organism. It seemed miraculous, though he knew it was simply part of the natural order, one of the many ways that life perpetuated itself, adapted, survived, thrived. The bells for Vespers rang out across the monastery grounds, and Edmund made his way to the chapel for the evening service. The light was beginning to slant and golden now, that particular quality of late afternoon that made everything look warm and beloved, and Edmund felt his heart swell with gratitude for this life, this place, these simple rhythms that shaped his days. The evening prayers were particularly beautiful, the chanting seeming to resonate with some deep chord within Edmund's chest, and when the service ended, he felt both energized and peaceful, ready for the evening ahead. Supper was simple, bread and cheese and some early radishes, and Edmund ate with a good appetite, his body hungry from the day's physical work. During recreation, Edmund chose to walk the monastery grounds rather than staying in the warming room with the other brothers. He made a circuit of the various buildings, nodding to brothers he passed, observing the work that each area represented. The bakehouse, where bread was made daily. The brewery, where small beer was produced for the brothers to drink. The workshops where various crafts were practiced. The library where manuscripts were copied and preserved. All of it connected, all of it necessary, all of it serving the community's needs. He ended his walk at the garden, unable to resist one final visit before Compline. The evening light was soft now, the sun low on the horizon, and everything looked gentle and peaceful. Edmund walked slowly through the beds, not checking or working, just being present, just appreciating the beauty of this place he tended. At the calendula bed, he knelt to examine his transplants one more time, and he was pleased to see that they had recovered completely from the morning's move. Their leaves were perky and reaching toward the fading light, and Edmund could almost sense them settling into their new home, their roots beginning to explore the soil around them, beginning the process of establishment that would allow them to flourish. He stayed kneeling for a long moment, his hands resting on his thighs, his breathing slow and easy. The garden was so quiet at this hour, the birds settling into their roosting places, the insects growing still as the temperature dropped. Edmund felt himself becoming part of this quiet, felt his own thoughts settling like silt in calm water, until there was nothing but presence, nothing but this moment, this place, this peaceful now. The bells for Compline brought him back to himself, and he rose slowly, his knees protesting slightly, and made his way to the chapel for the day's final prayers. The service passed in its familiar pattern, the words and music carrying Edmund towards sleep and rest, and when it ended and the great silence descended, he walked to the dormitory with slow, tired steps. In his bed, Edmund lay watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, his body pleasantly exhausted, his mind quiet and content. He thought briefly of the work waiting for him tomorrow, but without anxiety or pressure, just a gentle acknowledgement of the continuous nature of his calling. There would always be more to do, but there would also always be time to do it, season following season in their patient rhythm. Sleep came easily, pulling him down into dreams of green growth and gentle rain, of roots reaching deep into dark soil, of seeds splitting open to send forth new life, of the endless cycle of growth and rest that governed all living things. And in his dreams, Edmund tended his garden with the same patient attention he brought to his waking hours, his hands moving among the plants with love and care, his whole being given over to the work that gave his life meaning and purpose. The next morning brought a soft mist again, wrapping the monastery in gentle mystery, and Edmund rose with the bells as he always did, ready to begin another day of the quiet, patient work that he had been called to do. After lauds and breakfast, he made his way through the mist to his garden, and he paused at the gate as he always did, taking a moment to simply look, to appreciate, to give thanks for this place and this work and this life that had been given to him. Then he opened the gate and stepped inside, and the garden received him as it always did, patient and generous, full of growing things that needed his care, full of beauty and purpose, and the deep peace that came from living in harmony with the earth's ancient rhythms. And Brother Edmund, keeper of the monastery's herb garden, began his day's work with steady hands and a grateful heart, continuing the endless task of tending and nurturing, of paying attention and giving care, of participating in the great work of growth and healing that connected him to every gardener who had ever lived, who had ever placed their hands in soil and helped green things flourish. The mist would lift, the sun would warm the earth, the plants would grow and bloom and set seed, and through it all Edmund would be there, faithful and attentive, season after season, year after year, doing his small part in the vast and patient work of life. He moved first to check the seed bed where the parsley and borage had been sown, kneeling beside it and running his hand gently over the soil's surface. It was still too early to expect any visible signs of germination, but Edmund found comfort in the checking nonetheless, in the daily attention that allowed him to notice the moment when tiny green shoots finally pushed through the earth. Patience was the gardener's greatest virtue. Anselm had told him many times, and Edmund had learned the truth of those words through countless hours of waiting and watching. From the seed bed, he made his way to the area where his root vegetables grew, the small plot where he cultivated burdock and elecampane for their medicinal roots. These plants were still in their early growth, their large leaves just beginning to unfold, and Edmund examined them carefully for any signs of pest damage or disease. The burdock leaves were slightly riddled with tiny holes, evidence that some small insect had been feeding on them during the night, but the damage was minor and the plants vigorous enough to withstand it. Edmund decided to leave them be, trusting in the plant's natural resilience rather than intervening unnecessarily. The elecampane was showing particularly strong growth this year, its leaves already large and substantial, promising a good harvest of roots come autumn. Edmund touched one of the leaves gently, feeling its rough texture, admiring the way water droplets from the mist clung to its surface. This plant would grow tall by summer's end, sending up thick stems topped with large yellow flowers that looked something like small sunflowers, and its roots, when dried and prepared properly, made an excellent remedy for coughs and chest complaints. As the morning progressed and the mist began to thin, Edmund turned his attention to a task he had been planning for several days: the division of some of his established perennial herbs. Plants like chives and lemon balm tended to form large clumps over time, and these clumps benefited from being divided every few years, split into smaller sections that could be replanted to create new plants or to refresh tired soil with younger, more vigorous growth. He began with a large clump of chives that had been growing in the same spot for at least 4 years. Using his fork, he carefully loosened the soil around the plant, working the tines deep beneath the root mass, then levered it gently upward. The clump came free with a satisfying release, bringing with it a mass of white roots and dark soil. Edmund carried it to his potting bench and examined it closely, seeing how the individual bulbs had multiplied and pressed against each other, creating a dense tangle. With his hands, Edmund began pulling the clump apart, separating it into smaller sections, each containing a handful of bulbs with their attached roots and leaves. The work required a firm touch, but also gentleness, a balance between force and care that came from experience. Some of the outer bulbs came away easily, while others needed more persuasion. But eventually, Edmund had divided the original clump into 6 healthy sections. He replanted 3 of these sections back in the original bed, spacing them more generously than before, giving each one room to grow and expand over the coming years. The remaining 3 sections he potted in clay containers, thinking they might be useful gifts to other monasteries or to benefactors who had been particularly generous to the community. Plants made good gifts. Edmund had learned, tangible symbols of life and growth that cost nothing but time and attention. The work of dividing and replanting was satisfying in a deep way, creating abundance from what already existed, multiplying resources through simple attention and care. Edmund thought about how this principle applied to so much of monastic life. The way sharing seemed to increase rather than diminish what one had. The way generosity created its own kind of wealth that had nothing to do with money or possessions. By the time the bells rang for terce, Edmund had also divided a large clump of lemon balm and had begun work on some of the sorrel that grew in a damp corner of the garden. His hands were thoroughly earth-stained, and his habit had acquired several new smudges of dirt, but he felt energized by the morning's work, pleased with what he had accomplished. The prayer of terce was a welcome pause, and Edmund used the time to rest his back and shoulders, which were beginning to feel the strain of all the bending and lifting. He was not as young as he once had been, and he was learning to acknowledge his body's limits with acceptance rather than frustration. There would always be more work than hours in the day, but that was simply the nature of gardening, of tending living things that grew according to their own schedules rather than human convenience. After terce, Edmund decided to spend some time on a task that required less physical exertion, the harvesting of nettles from the wild area beyond the garden's eastern wall. Nettles grew abundantly there, in the uncultivated space between the garden and the sheep fold, and they were valuable both as medicine and as food. The young leaves, when cooked, made a nourishing potherb, rich in minerals, and they also had properties that helped with joint pain and spring fatigue. Edmund put on thick leather gloves before approaching the nettle patch, respectful of the plant's stinging hairs. He had learned as a novice what happened when one touched nettles with bare skin, the immediate burning sensation followed by raised welts that itched intensely. And while the sting was not dangerous, it was certainly unpleasant enough to avoid. With his gloves protecting his hands, however, he could harvest the tender top growth safely, cutting the stems cleanly with his knife and placing them in his basket. The nettles were at their prime now, in mid-spring, their leaves still young and tender before the plants began putting energy into flowering. Edmund worked methodically, selecting the best stems, leaving plenty behind to ensure the patch would continue thriving and producing. As he harvested, he thought about how even plants that most people considered weeds or nuisances often had valuable properties if one knew how to use them properly. The nettle's sting was a defense against being eaten, but humans had learned to work around that defense, to harvest and prepare the plant in ways that made it beneficial rather than harmful. With his basket half full of nettles, Edmund returned to the garden and carried his harvest to the kitchen, where Brother Martin received them with evident pleasure. "Excellent," Martin said, examining the tender green leaves. "We will have these for dinner today, cooked with a little butter and garlic." The brothers always enjoy them, though some complain they look too much like weeds to be appetizing. Edmund smiled at that. "Tell them that the best medicines often come in humble packages," he suggested, "and that these will help keep their joints supple and their blood strong." "I will tell them no such thing," Martin replied with a laugh. "If I mention medicine, they will eat them dutifully but without pleasure. Better to simply serve them well prepared and let them enjoy the taste without thinking too much about whether it is good for them." Edmund appreciated Martin's wisdom in this, the understanding that people responded better to pleasure than to duty, that the best way to help others was often to make beneficial things enjoyable rather than presenting them as obligations. He left the Nestles with Martin and returned to his garden, feeling the morning's work settling into his body as satisfying tiredness. The rest of the morning he spent on gentler tasks, deadheading some of the early flowers that had finished blooming, checking his various beds for any signs of problems, and watering areas that seemed to be drying out more quickly than others. The sun had burned away the last of the mist and was now shining strongly, warming the earth and encouraging growth in everything it touched. At Sext, the midday prayer, Edmund found himself standing near the back of the chapel as usual, and he noticed Brother Thomas across the way, the young monk looking considerably more rested and peaceful than he had when they first spoke about his sleep troubles. Their eyes met briefly, and Thomas gave him a small nod of acknowledgement and gratitude, a wordless communication that warmed Edmund's heart. This was what his work was ultimately about, he thought, not just growing plants but helping people, easing suffering, contributing to the well-being of his community in whatever ways he could. Dinner was the promised nettle dish, and Edmund was pleased to see that Martin had prepared it beautifully, the greens tender and flavorful, seasoned perfectly with the garlic and butter, and a touch of salt. Several of the brothers made appreciative comments about the dish, and Edmund ate his portion with quiet satisfaction, knowing that he had played a part in bringing this nourishment to the table. The afternoon was warm and bright, and Edmund decided to work on maintaining the paths that wound through the garden. Over time, the gravel that covered the paths tended to scatter and thin, pushed aside by feet and weather, and it needed to be raked back into place and occasionally supplemented with fresh stone. Edmund fetched a rake from the tool shed and began working his way systematically through the garden, pulling the gravel back toward the centers of the paths, evening out the surface, creating clean edges where paths met bed. The work was repetitive and somewhat mindless, requiring attention but not intense concentration, and Edmund found it meditative, his body moving in steady rhythm while his mind drifted peacefully. He thought about the changing seasons, about how spring would soon give way to summer, about all the work that lay ahead as the garden reached its peak of productivity. There would be constant harvesting to do, regular watering during dry spells, vigilance against pests and diseases, the ongoing maintenance that kept everything healthy and thriving. But there would also be abundance, he reminded himself, an abundance of fresh herbs and flowers, of scents and colors and textures, of the deep satisfaction that came from seeing his careful work rewarded with generous growth. Summer was both the busiest and the most rewarding time in the garden, when everything seemed to pulse with life and energy, when every visit brought new discoveries, new blooms, new harvests to be gathered and prepared. As he raked, Edmund became aware of voices nearby and looked up to see several of the younger monks walking past the garden, engaged in animated conversation. They were too far away for him to hear what they were discussing, but their gestures and expressions suggested some kind of intellectual debate, perhaps about a text they had been studying or a theological question that had arisen during their lessons. Edmund watched them for a moment, appreciating their youthful energy and enthusiasm, remembering his own younger years when everything had seemed so urgent and important. He had learned over time to value the quiet over the urgent, the steady over the spectacular. His work in the garden had taught him that the most important things often happen slowly, almost invisibly, roots growing deep underground, seeds germinating in darkness, plants building strength cell by cell, day by day. There was wisdom in this slowness, Edmund thought, a teaching about patience and trust, and the value of sustained attention over time. By the time the bells rang for none, Edmund had finished with the paths, and they looked neat and well-maintained, their gravel surfaces smooth and even, their edges clean and defined. He put away his rake and washed his hands at the water barrel, then made his way to the chapel for the afternoon prayer. The service was brief, as none always was, but it provided a welcome pause in the day's rhythm, a moment to center himself before continuing with the afternoon's remaining tasks. After none, Edmund decided to check on the progress of the herbs he had set to dry several days earlier. He walked to the drying shed and found that most of them had reached the perfect stage of dryness, their leaves crisp and brittle, ready to be stripped from their stems and stored for Brother Gilbert's use. He settled himself at the work table and began the careful process of removing the dried leaves, working slowly so as not to crush them more than necessary, wanting to preserve their integrity and potency. The few leaves came away easily from their stems, falling into the wooden bowl he had placed beneath his hands with soft, rustling sounds. Edmund worked in a steady rhythm, his fingers moving automatically through the familiar motions while his mind remained peacefully quiet. There was something deeply satisfying about this work, about taking the raw harvest and transforming it into medicine, about being part of the long chain of preparation that connected plant to patient, garden to healing. When he had finished stripping the feverfew, Edmund moved on to the horehound, which was slightly more tedious as the leaves were smaller and more firmly attached to their woody stems. He persevered patiently, not rushing, allowing the work to take the time it needed. The afternoon light slanted through the shed's open side, creating patterns of brightness and shadow on his work table, and Edmund found himself noticing the beauty of even this simple scene. The way the dried herbs looked in the golden light, the way his hands moved through their task with practiced sureness. A butterfly drifted into the shed, attracted perhaps by the concentrated scent of herbs, and Edmund paused in his work to watch it explore, landing briefly on one drying bundle and then another, its delicate wings opening and closing slowly. It was a small tortoise shell, its wings patterned in orange and brown and black, and Edmund admired its beauty for several long moments before it flew back out into the garden, disappearing among the flowering plants. By the time Edmund had finished preparing all the dried herbs, dividing them into cloth bags and labeling each one carefully with its contents and the date of harvest, the afternoon was growing late, and the light was beginning to take on that warm, slanting quality that spoke of approaching evening. He carried the bags to the infirmary and found Brother Gilbert there, as he usually was at this hour, working on some preparation or other. "Edmund, good afternoon," Gilbert greeted him warmly. "What have you brought me today?" "Feverfew, horehound, and some comfrey," Edmund replied, setting the bags on Gilbert's work table, "all well dried and ready for use." Gilbert opened each bag and examined its contents, bringing samples to his nose and inhaling deeply. "Perfect," he pronounced with satisfaction. "The quality is excellent as always. You have a true gift for knowing exactly when to harvest and how to preserve." He paused, looking at Edmund with genuine warmth. "I do not say it often enough, but I am deeply grateful for your work, Edmund. The medicines you provide are the foundation of everything I do here. Without you, I would be greatly limited in how I could help our brothers." Edmund felt himself coloring slightly at the praise, uncomfortable as always with such direct acknowledgement. "We each do our part," he said quietly. "Your skill in using the herbs is as important as my growing them. We work together in this, as in all things." "That is true," Gilbert agreed. "But still, I wanted you to know that your work is seen and valued. Not everyone has the temperament for the patient attention that gardening requires, and we are fortunate that you do." They spoke for a few more minutes about various herbs and their uses, about what Gilbert might need in the coming weeks as the season progressed, and then Edmund took his leave, making his way back to the garden for one final circuit before Vespers. The evening light was beautiful now, soft and golden, making everything look as if it were painted by a loving hand, and Edmund walked slowly, not wanting to rush through this peaceful time. At the violet patch, he knelt once more to check on the small plants, and he was delighted to see that they had continued spreading, sending out new runners that were already beginning to root where they touched the soil. The flowers were still blooming, their purple petals glowing in the evening light, and Edmund touched one gently, marveling at its delicate beauty. These violets had become something special to him, a gift from the earth itself, a reminder that the garden held mysteries and surprises beyond what any keeper could plan or control. He stood and continued his walk, checking on his various beds, noting what had changed since morning, what would need attention tomorrow. The calendula transplants were looking stronger, their leaves now fully recovered from the move. The chives he had divided were already perking up in their new positions. The seed bed remained unchanged, at least to casual observation, though Edmund knew that beneath the soil's surface profound transformations were taking place. Seeds swelling with absorbed moisture, embryonic roots beginning to push through seed coats, the invisible miracle of germination proceeding at its own patient pace. The bells for Vespers rang out across the monastery grounds, and Edmund made his way to the chapel for the evening service. The light streaming through the windows was particularly beautiful at this hour, and the chanting seemed to resonate with some deep harmony that connected earth and heaven, human voices, and divine presence. Edmund sang with his whole heart, feeling himself part of something vast and eternal, something that transcended his individual life while giving it meaning and purpose. After Vespers came supper, a simple meal of bread and cheese and some of the early peas from the kitchen garden, sweet and tender. Edmund ate mindfully, aware of the gift of food, of the labor that had gone into producing it, of the way it would nourish his body for tomorrow's work. Around him, his brothers ate in companionable silence, the quiet broken only by the voice of the reader sharing passages from the lives of the saints. During recreation, Edmund chose to return to the garden once more, unable to resist the pull of that peaceful place in the soft evening light. He found the orange cat there, stretched out in a patch of fatting sunlight near the rosemary, and he sat down on a nearby bench to keep the animal company. The cat opened one green eye to regard him, then apparently decided he was acceptable and closed it again, continuing its rest. Edmund sat quietly, letting the peace of the garden settle into his bones. He could hear birds singing their evening songs in the hedgerow, could smell the mingled scents of growing herbs, could feel the gentle warmth of the day's stored heat radiating from the stone bench beneath him. This was contentment, he thought, this simple presence in a place of beauty, asking nothing, needing nothing, simply being. The cat eventually stirred and stretched, then rose and padded away into the gathering dusk, disappearing between the beds on some feline errand. Edmund watched it go, then rose himself, knowing that Compline would soon be calling him to the day's final prayers. He walked slowly toward the garden gate, pausing once to look back at the beds and paths, at the plants growing in their appointed places, at this small piece of earth that he had been given to tend. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, new growth to observe, new challenges to meet. But tonight, all was well. The garden rested in the evening quiet, the plants drawing in moisture from the cooling air, roots continuing their invisible work in the dark soil, everything following the ancient patterns that governed all growing things. And Brother Edmund, keeper of this garden, walked toward the chapel with a grateful heart, ready to offer the day's final prayers before surrendering to the rest that would prepare him for whatever tomorrow would bring. In the chapel, the brothers gathered for Compline, their voices joining in the chants that marked the transition into night. Edmund sang the familiar words, feeling them carry away the day's small concerns, preparing him for sleep and renewal. When the service ended and the great silence descended, he walked to the dormitory with slow, peaceful steps, his body pleasantly tired, his mind quiet and clear. In his narrow bed, Edmund lay watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. His last thoughts before sleep were of the garden waiting for him in the morning, of seeds germinating invisibly beneath the soil, of plants growing steadily in the darkness, of the continuous work of life that never ceased, never paused, always continuing in its patient rhythm. He thought of Brother Thomas sleeping peacefully, helped by the herbs Edmund had prepared, of Brother Ambrose free from his headaches, of all the small ways his work touched the lives of those around him. Sleep came gently, pulling him down into dreams of green growth and golden light, of hands in soil and the scent of herbs, of seasons turning in their endless cycle, of the great work of tending and nurturing that connected him to gardeners past and future, to all who had ever placed their hands in earth and helped life flourish. The next morning came cool and clear, perfect weather for working in the garden, and Edmund rose with the bells as he always did, ready to begin another day of the quiet, faithful work that shaped his life. After lauds and breakfast, he made his way through the morning light to his garden, and he paused at the gate as he always did, taking a moment to simply look, to appreciate, to give thanks. Then he opened the gate and stepped inside, and the garden received him as it always did, patient and generous, full of growing things that needed his care. Brother Edmund, keeper of the monastery's herb garden, began his day's work with steady hands and a peaceful heart, continuing the endless task of tending and nurturing, of paying attention and giving care, season following season, in the great patient work of life that had no end but only continued, quietly and beautifully, day after day after day. The morning's first task was to check the cuttings he had potted several days earlier, to see if they were continuing to establish themselves. Edmund carried a small pitcher of water to where the pots sat in their sheltered corner and examined each cutting carefully. They looked healthy, their leaves still firm and green, showing no signs of wilting or stress. It would still be several weeks before they developed sufficient roots to be transplanted, but they were progressing well, and Edmund felt satisfied with their condition as he gave each pot a careful drink of water. From the cuttings, he moved to the main garden beds to observe what changes the night had brought. The dew was still heavy on the plants, each leaf and stem adorned with tiny droplets that caught the morning light and turned it into countless small sparks of brightness. Edmund walked slowly, letting his eyes take in everything, noting that the calendula transplants seemed to have grown visibly overnight, their leaves larger and more robust, their roots clearly establishing themselves in their new home. The chives that he had divided were also showing signs of recovery, their hollow leaves standing more upright, their color deepening from the pale yellow-green of stress back to the rich dark green of health. Edmund felt a quiet satisfaction at this evidence that his work had been done properly, that the plants were responding as they should to good care and attention. As he walked, Edmund heard the monastery's bells marking terce, and he made his way to the chapel for the brief morning prayer. The service refreshed him as it always did, giving him a moment to step back from his immediate tasks and remember the larger pattern of which his work was a part, the rhythm of prayer and labor that structured monastic life and gave it meaning beyond mere productivity. After terce, Edmund returned to the garden with a specific purpose in mind. He wanted to harvest some of the early mint for Brother Martin, who had mentioned the previous day that he would like to make mint sauce to accompany the roasted lamb that would be served for the upcoming feast day. The mint bed was lush and vigorous, the plants growing with the enthusiasm that characterized all members of the mint family, and Edmund had no qualms about taking a generous harvest. He cut the stems cleanly with his knife, selecting the freshest, most tender growth, leaving the older, tougher stems behind. The scent that rose from the cut mint was sharp and clean, wonderfully refreshing, and Edmund breathed it in deeply, feeling it clear his head and lift his spirits. Within a short time, he had gathered a large bundle, more than enough for Martin's needs, and he carried it to the kitchen, where the brother received it with evident delight, already planning how he would prepare it to best complement the lamb. The rest of the morning Edmund spent on routine maintenance, moving through the garden with practiced efficiency, deadheading flowers that had finished blooming, pinching back plants that were growing too vigorously, pulling the occasional weed that had managed to establish itself despite his previous efforts. It was the kind of ongoing, never quite finished work that constituted the bulk of a gardener's life, the constant small interventions that kept everything healthy and productive. By the time the bells rang for sext, Edmund had worked his way through most of the garden's beds, and he felt satisfied with the morning's progress. The midday prayer was brief and welcome, giving his body a chance to rest, and his mind a moment of quiet reflection before the afternoon's work began. Dinner was substantial. A thick soup made with dried lentils and some of the early carrots from the kitchen garden, and Edmund ate with good appetite, his morning's labor having given him a healthy hunger. The reading during the meal was from the Gospel, familiar passages about seeds and growing things, about the mustard seed that became a great tree and the sower who scattered his seed on various types of ground. Edmund listened with particular attention, hearing these agricultural parables with a gardener's understanding, appreciating their wisdom about patience and faith, and the mysterious ways that small beginnings could lead to abundant results. The afternoon was warm, warmer than previous days had been, and Edmund decided to spend it working in the shadier parts of the garden where the heat would be less intense. He made his way to the bed where his medicinal roots grew, the burdock and elecampane that would not be ready for harvest until autumn but that needed attention now to ensure healthy development. The burdock plants were showing more of the insect damage he had noticed earlier, small holes in the large leaves where some creature had been feeding. Edmund examined the plants carefully, looking for the culprit, and eventually found several small caterpillars clinging to the undersides of leaves. They were green and fuzzy, no longer than his smallest finger, and they were methodically chewing their way through the burdock's foliage. Edmund considered his options. He could remove the caterpillars by hand, dropping them in a bucket of water, thus protecting his burdock from further damage. Or he could leave them, accepting that they too needed to eat, that they were part of the garden's larger ecology, and would eventually transform into moths that might pollinate his flowers or serve as food for the birds that helped control other pests. The burdock plants were large and vigorous enough to withstand the damage, Edmund decided, and he chose to leave the caterpillars where they were. This was part of the balance he tried to maintain in the garden, not trying to eliminate all pests and predators, but rather allowing a certain amount of natural interaction, trusting that things would generally work themselves out if he did not interfere too much. Anselm had taught him this approach, had shown him that a garden too rigidly controlled often became fragile and dependent, while one allowed some natural chaos tended to be more resilient and self-sustaining. Moving on from the burdock, Edmund spent time weeding around the elecampane, which was growing in a slightly damper area where unwanted plants tended to establish themselves more readily. The soil here was rich and dark, almost black, and it clung to his fingers as he worked, cool and slightly sticky. Edmund pulled the weeds carefully, making sure to get all their roots, not wanting to leave any pieces behind that might regenerate. As he worked, Edmund became aware of voices approaching, and he looked up to see Brother Gilbert walking toward him, accompanied by an older monk whom Edmund did not recognize. The stranger was thin and stooped, his habit worn and patched, his face deeply lined with age and, Edmund thought, with pain. Gilbert caught Edmund's eye and made a small gesture, indicating they wished to speak with him. Edmund rose from his weeding and brushed the soil from his hands, walking over to meet them. "Brother Edmund," Gilbert said, "this is Brother Jerome, visiting from the monastery at Whitby. He has traveled a long way and is suffering from the journey. I thought perhaps you might have something that could help ease his discomfort." Edmund bowed slightly to the visiting monk, who returned the gesture with evident effort. "What troubles you, brother?" Edmund asked gently. "My joints," Jerome replied, his voice thin and reedy. "The long walking, the damp sleeping places along the road, they have made everything ache, my knees especially and my hands." He held up his gnarled fingers, which were clearly swollen and stiff. Edmund nodded sympathetically. He himself had begun to experience similar stiffness in his own joints on cold mornings, though not yet to the degree this poor man suffered. "I have something that may help," he said. "Come with me to the drying shed and I will prepare it for you." He led Gilbert and Jerome to the shed and found the jar where he stored dried nettle leaves. "Nettle tea," he explained as he measured a generous portion into a cloth bag. "Drink it 3 times daily, steeped in hot water until the liquid is dark green. It will help reduce the inflammation in your joints and may ease the pain considerably." He also took down a small clay pot containing a salve he had made earlier in the spring, a mixture of comfrey and calendula infused in oil and then thickened with beeswax. "And this," he said, handing it to Jerome, "rub this into your knees and hands before you sleep. It will help with the stiffness and may bring you more comfortable rest." Jerome took the offerings with evident gratitude, his eyes growing damp with tears. "Thank you, brother," he said quietly. "You are kind enough to help a stranger." "We are all brothers," Edmund replied simply. "And the garden's gifts are meant to be shared. Use these freely, and if you need more before you continue your journey, come find me and I will provide it." After Gilbert and Jerome had left, Edmund returned to his weeding, but his mind stayed with the visiting monk, thinking about the hardships of travel in these times, the way pilgrims and travelers suffered from exposure and poor conditions, the many small miseries that came from being away from home and familiar comforts. It made him grateful for his own settled life, for the routine and stability of the monastery, for the garden that gave him both purpose and peace. The afternoon passed in this quiet work, Edmund moving from bed to bed, attending to whatever needed attention, his hands busy while his mind remained peacefully quiet. At none, he joined his brothers for the brief afternoon prayer, grateful for the pause, for the chance to straighten his back and rest his knees. After none, Edmund decided to check his seed bed once more, though he still did not expect to see any germination. But when he knelt beside the bed and looked carefully, his heart leaped with delight. There, pushing through the soil in one small section, were the first tiny green loops of emerging borage seedlings, their distinctive curved shape unmistakable. The parsley showed no signs yet, as he had expected, but the borage had germinated, and Edmund felt a surge of joy at this evidence of new life, of seeds fulfilling their purpose, of the garden's endless capacity for renewal. He stayed kneeling for several long moments, simply looking at the tiny seedlings, marveling at their perfection, at the way they pushed through the soil with such determined vigor. These small green shoots contained within them the complete instructions for becoming full plants with large hairy leaves and beautiful blue flowers, and Edmund felt privileged to witness this early stage of their development, to be present at this beginning. The bells for Vespers rang out across the monastery grounds, pulling Edmund from his contemplation. He rose slowly, his knees stiff from kneeling, and made his way to the chapel for the evening service. The light was beginning to slant and golden now, and the chanting seemed to carry on the warm air, creating an atmosphere of peace and beauty that touched Edmund deeply. After Vespers came supper, and tonight the meal included the roasted lamb that Brother Martin had been preparing, served with the mint sauce made from Edmund's harvest. The combination was delicious, the richness of the meat balanced perfectly by the bright, fresh taste of the mint, and Edmund ate with deep appreciation, aware once again of the connection between his work and the nourishment of his community. During recreation, Edmund sought out Brother William at the sheep fold, wanting to tell him about the excellent lamb they had enjoyed at supper. He found William there as expected, moving among his flock in the soft evening light, checking each animal with the kind of careful attention that Edmund recognized from his own practice. "Brother William," Edmund called out as he approached, "that lamb at supper was magnificent. You have done excellent work with your flock." William looked up and smiled, clearly pleased by the compliment. "Thank you, Edmund. It is always satisfying when the work of our hands nourishes the community well." He gestured toward the sheep grazing peacefully in their fold. "These are good animals, gentle and healthy. They give us meat and wool, and their presence brings me peace, just as your garden does for you." They stood together at the fence, watching the sheep in companionable silence. The lambs were larger now than when Edmund had last seen them, their legs longer and their movements more confident, though they still stayed close to their mothers. One of them approached the fence where Edmund and William stood, bleating softly, its dark eyes curious and trusting. "They grow so quickly," Edmund observed. "It seems like only yesterday they were newborns, barely able to stand." "Time moves differently when we are paying attention," William replied thoughtfully. "The days feel long, but when we look back, the weeks and months have passed in what seems like moments." He paused, then added, "I suppose it is the same with your plants. You tend them daily, and each day seems full and complete, but suddenly it is harvest time and you wonder where the season went." Edmund nodded, appreciating William's insight. "That is exactly right," he said. "The work itself fills the time, makes each moment meaningful, but the larger patterns move so quickly that it can be startling to suddenly realize how much has changed." They talked for a while longer about their respective work, about the rhythms of tending living things, about the satisfaction that came from seeing healthy growth and development. Edmund found comfort in these conversations with William, in the recognition that despite their different responsibilities, they shared a similar relationship with their work, a similar understanding of what it meant to care for life. The bells for Compline rang out, and Edmund took his leave of William, making his way to the chapel for the day's final prayers. The light was nearly gone now, just a faint glow remaining in the western sky, and the chapel was dim and peaceful, lit only by a few candles that sent their warm light flickering across the stone walls. The prayers of Compline settled over Edmund like a gentle blanket, preparing him for sleep and rest. He sang the familiar words with a full heart, feeling gratitude for the day he had been given, for the work that filled his hours, for the community that surrounded him with support and companionship. When the service ended and the great silence descended, he walked to the dormitory with slow, peaceful steps. In his narrow bed, Edmund lay watching the stars through the window, brighter now in the fully dark sky. His body was pleasantly tired, his muscles warm and loose from the day's labor. He thought about the borage seedlings pushing through the soil, about Brother Jerome finding relief from his pain, about the lamb they had eaten and the mint that had flavored it, about all the ways his work wove itself into the fabric of daily life. Sleep came easily, pulling him down into dreams of green growth and golden light, of tiny seedlings emerging from dark soil, of hands gently tending fragile life, of the endless patient work that connected past to future, one day to the next, in the great continuous pattern that gave meaning and purpose to everything he did. The morning came with birdsong, the sweet, clear notes of thrushes and blackbirds greeting the dawn, and Edmund rose with the bells as he always did, ready to begin another day. After lauds and breakfast, he made his way to the garden through the soft morning light, and his first stop was the seed bed, eager to see if more of the borage had germinated overnight. He was rewarded with the sight of several more seedlings pushing through the soil, their green loops catching the early light, and Edmund knelt beside them with a sense of wonder that never diminished, no matter how many times he witnessed this miracle of germination. These tiny plants were the future, he thought, the next generation that would grow and bloom and produce seeds of their own, continuing the cycle that had no true beginning or end, but simply continued, season after season, year after year, in the patient rhythm that governed all living things. Brother Edmund, keeper of the monastery's herb garden, began his day's work with steady hands and a grateful heart, tending the new life that had emerged, caring for the established plants that depended on his attention, continuing the endless task that he had been given, faithful and patient, in the great work of growth and nurturing that connected him to the earth, and to all who had ever placed their hands in soil and helped green things flourish. The morning unfolded in its familiar rhythm, Edmund moving through the garden with practiced ease, checking each bed, noting what had changed, what needed attention. The calendula transplants were settling in beautifully, their leaves now reaching upward with renewed vigor. The chives he had divided showed fresh green growth emerging from their centers. The comfrey bed was lush and full, the plants nearly ready for another harvest. Everything progressed according to its own internal timing, and Edmund's role was simply to observe and support, to provide what was needed and otherwise allow the plants to follow their nature. He decided to spend some time this morning working on the bed where his culinary herbs grew alongside the medicinal ones, an area that served both Brother Martin's kitchen needs and Brother Gilbert's healing work. The thyme was beginning to show its tiny flowers, pale purple blooms that would attract bees in great numbers once they opened fully. Edmund knelt beside the thyme and began carefully removing any remaining weeds, his fingers moving gently among the low-growing plants, taking care not to damage their spreading stems. As he worked, Edmund heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see Brother Jerome, the visiting monk from Whitby, walking slowly toward him. The man moved with less obvious pain than he had the previous day. Edmund noted with satisfaction, his steps more confident, his posture slightly less rigid. "Brother Edmund," Jerome called out softly as he drew near. "I hoped I might find you here. I wanted to thank you properly for the remedies you gave me yesterday. I slept better last night than I have in many weeks, and this morning my joints feel considerably improved." Edmund rose from his work and smiled at the older monk. "I am glad the herbs are helping," he said simply. "How are you finding the nettle tea?" "Bitter," Jerome replied with a slight grimace, "but I can feel that it is doing good work. Brother Gilbert told me to drink it faithfully, and I will do so." He paused, looking around the garden with evident appreciation. "This is a beautiful place. I can feel the peace here, the care you have put into it." "The garden gives more than I give to it," Edmund said, echoing words Anselm had often spoken to him. "I am simply the current keeper, one in a long line of brothers who have tended this ground. The real work is done by the plants themselves, following patterns older than our order, older than any human memory." Jerome nodded slowly, understanding in his weathered face. "Still, it takes wisdom to tend without interfering, to know when to act and when to simply allow. Not everyone has that gift." He looked at Edmund with a directness that was somehow both gentle and penetrating. "May I walk with you for a while? I find that moving helps my joints, and I would enjoy learning more about what you grow here." "Of course," Edmund replied, pleased by the request. He led Jerome slowly through the garden, nomming each plant they passed, explaining its uses, sharing small observations about its growth habits and preferences. Jerome listened with evident interest, asking thoughtful questions, occasionally pausing to touch a leaf or smell a flower, his movements still careful but noticeably easier than they had been the day before. They came to the violet patch, and Edmund knelt to show Jerome the small plants that had appeared unbidden in the shade of the apple tree. "These came on their own," he explained. "I did not plant them. They were simply here one morning, a gift from the earth itself." Jerome lowered himself carefully to kneel beside Edmund, examining the violets with gentle attention. "Some of the best gifts come unasked for," he said quietly. "We plan and work and strive, and those efforts bear fruit in their own way. But sometimes grace appears without our asking, and we must simply receive it with gratitude." Edmund nodded, moved by the older monk's words, sensing in them a wisdom that came from long years of living and observing and learning to accept what life offered. They knelt together in companionable silence for a moment, looking at the small purple flowers, and Edmund felt a kinship with this visiting brother, a recognition that despite their different paths and experiences, they shared an understanding of what truly mattered. The bells for terce rang out and both monks rose slowly, their knees protesting the movement. Jerome smiled ruefully. Age comes to us all, he said, but it brings its own gifts along with its burdens. I am slower now than I was, but I notice more, I think. The small beauties that I might have hurried past in my youth now seem worth pausing for. They walked together to the chapel for the morning prayer, and Edmund found himself reflecting on Jerome's words throughout the brief service. It was true that age brought limitations, but it also brought a different kind of sight, a deeper appreciation for the present moment, for the small graces that filled ordinary days. Edmund had noticed this in himself over recent years, the way his pleasure in simple things had deepened even as his physical capabilities had begun their gradual decline. After terce, Jerome returned to the guest house to rest, and Edmund went back to his garden. He spent the rest of the morning working on various maintenance tasks, tying up plants that needed support, checking his water barrels to see if they needed refilling, examining leaves for signs of disease or pest damage. The work was peaceful and absorbing, requiring just enough attention to keep his mind engaged, but not so much that it felt taxing or stressful. At Sext, the midday prayer, Edmund found himself standing near Brother Thomas again, and he noticed that the young monk looked well-rested and peaceful, his earlier troubles with sleep clearly resolved. It gave Edmund a quiet satisfaction to know that his simple mixture of herbs had made such a difference in Thomas's life, and had helped restore the rest that was so essential to health and well-being. Dinner was pottage made with early peas and some smoked bacon, hearty and flavorful, and Edmund ate with a good appetite while listening to the reading. Today's text was from the book of Ecclesiastes, the familiar passage about there being a time for everything, a season for every activity under heaven, a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to tear down and a time to build up. Edmund found the words particularly meaningful, resonating as they did with his daily experience in the garden, where everything truly did have its proper time, its season, its moment for particular actions. The afternoon was warm and still, the air thick with the promise of rain, though the sky remained mostly clear. Edmund decided to spend it harvesting more herbs for drying, as the weather would likely break soon, and then the plants would be too wet for proper curing. He began with sage, cutting stems from his established plants with careful attention to not taking too much from any single one, wanting to leave enough growth that the plants would continue thriving. The sage released its distinctive scent as he cut it, that earthy, slightly peppery smell that Edmund associated with both healing and flavoring. He gathered a substantial bundle, enough to hang in the drying shed where it would cure slowly over the coming weeks, concentrating its oils and intensifying its properties. Brother Gilbert used sage for sore throats and mouth troubles, while Brother Martin valued it for seasoning rich meats and fatty dishes, the herb's strong flavor cutting through heaviness and aiding digestion. Next, Edmund moved to the oregano bed, where the plants were growing thick and lush, their small leaves dense with aromatic oils. Oregano was at its best just before flowering, when all its energy was concentrated in the leaves rather than being diverted to seed production, and Edmund judged that now was the perfect time for harvesting. He cut generously, knowing the plants would quickly regenerate, sending up fresh growth that could be harvested again later in the summer. As he worked, Edmund noticed clouds beginning to gather in the western sky, building slowly but steadily, confirming his instinct that rain was approaching. He quickened his pace slightly, wanting to get his harvested herbs under cover before any moisture fell. The last thing he needed was for his carefully cut herbs to get wet, which would delay their drying and potentially cause them to mold or spoil. He carried his bundles to the drying shed and began the process of tying them, gathering several stems together and binding them with twine, creating bundles that would hang upside down from the rafters. The work required care to ensure the bundles were not too large, as herbs packed too tightly would not dry properly, but also not so loose that they would fall apart. Edmund had done this work countless times, and his hands moved with automatic precision, tying secure knots that would hold through weeks of drying. By the time he had finished hanging all his harvests, the clouds had thickened considerably, and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. Edmund stood under the shed's overhang and watched the rain come, at first just a gentle pattering and then growing heavier, drumming on the roof and creating a silvery curtain between him and the rest of the garden. The plants would welcome this water, he thought, especially after the warm, dry morning they had enjoyed. He decided to use this rainy time for indoor work, tasks that did not require him to be out among the beds. He settled at his work table and began cleaning and sharpening his tools, using a whetstone to restore keen edges to his knives and pruning shears. Good tools were essential for good work, Anselm had always insisted, and keeping them clean and sharp showed respect both for the tools themselves and for the plants they would be used on. The rain continued steadily, and Edmund worked in peaceful contentment, the sound of water on the roof creating a soothing background music. His mind drifted as his hands moved through the familiar motions of sharpening, thinking about nothing in particular, simply being present in the moment, in this shelter, doing this simple, necessary work. When the bells rang for none, Edmund set aside his tools and made his way through the rain to the chapel, his habit growing damp despite his attempts to stay under the covered walkways. The brief afternoon prayer was refreshing, and when it ended, Edmund returned to the drying shed to find that the rain had slowed to a light drizzle. He ventured out into the garden to see how everything had weathered the downpour. The plants looked refreshed and vital, their leaves washed clean, their stems standing straighter as if reinvigorated by the moisture. Puddles had formed in the lower areas of paths, reflecting the gray sky like small mirrors, and Edmund walked carefully to avoid splashing through them. He checked his seed bed and was pleased to see that more borage seedlings had emerged, their tiny green loops pushing through the damp soil, taking advantage of the rain's encouragement. The parsley bed still showed no signs of germination, but Edmund was patient. Parsley was notoriously slow, sometimes taking 3 or even 4 weeks to sprout, and he had learned long ago not to worry about its leisurely pace. The seeds were there in the soil, and they would emerge when they were ready, following their own internal timing that had nothing to do with human impatience or desire. Edmund spent the remaining time before Vespers simply walking through the garden, observing, appreciating, letting his practiced eye note what had changed with the rain, what looked healthier, what might need attention tomorrow. This kind of observation was as important as any active work. He had learned, this daily witness to the garden's state, this accumulation of knowledge that came from sustained attention over time. The evening service was particularly beautiful, the rain-washed air seeming to clarify the sound of the chanting, and Edmund sang with deep feeling, his voice joining with his brothers in the ancient harmonies that had been sung in this place for generations. When Vespers ended, he made his way to supper with a sense of quiet contentment, grateful for the day he had been given, for the work that had filled his hours, for the rain that had watered his garden. Supper was simple but nourishing, bread and cheese with some early radishes from the kitchen garden, crisp and peppery. Edmund ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware of the way the food filled him with warmth and energy. Around him, his brothers ate in their customary silence, the only sound the voice of the reader sharing passages from the lives of the Desert Fathers, those ancient monks who had sought God in solitude and simplicity. During recreation, Edmund found himself drawn once more to the garden, unable to resist a final visit before Compline. The rain had stopped completely now, and the evening air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of wet earth and growing things. He walked slowly along the paths, his footsteps soft on the damp gravel, his eyes taking in the familiar shapes of beds and plants in the gathering dusk. At the violet patch, he knelt one last time, touching the small purple flowers gently, feeling their delicate petals beneath his fingertips. These unexpected gifts had become something precious to him, a reminder that the garden held mysteries beyond his planning or control, that grace appeared in its own time and its own way, asking only to be noticed and received with gratitude. He thought of Brother Jerome, resting in the guest house with less pain than he had carried for weeks, helped by simple herbs that Edmund had grown and prepared. He thought of Brother Thomas, sleeping peacefully now after his struggles with restless nights. He thought of all the brothers who would be nourished tomorrow by herbs from this garden, who would be healed by its medicines, whose lives were quietly supported by the work Edmund did here day after day. The bells for Compline rang out across the monastery grounds, calling him to the day's final prayers. Edmund rose slowly from beside the violets and made his way toward the chapel, his heart full of quiet gratitude. The light was nearly gone now, just the faintest glow remaining in the western sky, and the first stars were beginning to appear overhead. In the chapel, the brothers gathered for the last time, their voices joining in the gentle chants that marked the transition into night. Edmund sang the familiar words, feeling them carry away the day's small concerns, feeling himself being prepared for the rest that would renew him for tomorrow's work. When the service ended and the great silence descended, he walked to the dormitory with peaceful steps, his body pleasantly tired, his mind quiet and clear. In his narrow bed, Edmund lay watching the stars brighten in the darkening sky. His hands still carried the faint scent of herbs, sage and oregano and thyme, the perfume of the garden that followed him even into sleep. His last thoughts were of seeds germinating in dark soil, of roots reaching down and leaves reaching up, of the patient work of growth that continued even now, even in darkness, the great cycle that never ceased but only continued, quietly and beautifully, bringing forth life in its own perfect time. And Brother Edmund, keeper of the monastery's herb garden, let himself drift into sleep with a peaceful heart, his work complete for this day, ready to begin again tomorrow, continuing the endless gentle task of tending and nurturing, of paying attention and giving care, season following season, in the great patient work that connected him to the earth and to all who had ever grown green things with loving hands. The garden rested in the darkness, receiving the night's cool air, drawing moisture from the damp soil, preparing for another day of growth and life. And Edmund rested too, his breathing deepening, his body releasing into the forgiving embrace of sleep, dreaming of spring mornings and golden afternoons, of hands in soil and the endless quiet joy of watching life unfold, one day at a time, in the gentle rhythm that gave his existence meaning